Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm Tercy Recaps, and today, get comfortable because a great story is about to begin. The story begins with an immense horde of immortal beings who managed to break the natural cycle of life and death, conquerors of worlds, dimensional travelers who had set their sights on a small blue planet called Earth. For them, taking it was only a matter of time, or so they thought, and in the midst of that destructive scenario, a skeletal monk shudders as he witnesses something he cannot comprehend. A mere human with a sinister appearance who, despite being completely torn apart, keeps moving forward with an unsettling calm, his body slowly reconstructing itself, approaching the being who had underestimated him, and, with brutal force, he shows him his grave mistake, as a single blow is enough to reduce the skeleton to nothing more than dust. And so the story goes back 2 years, when a young man was being scolded by his sister for being a lazy, unemployed, and wannabe failed gamer, warning him that if he didn't find a job, she would send him back to their parents. But he, clearly drunk, replied that he'd be embarrassed to live with them at his age, while his sister looked at him like a shameless freeloader who only lived off his younger sister, and warned him that he had to find something with the new year coming. But he, too drunk, asked to talk about it the next day, stumbling into his room and falling face first onto the bed. And this is where he accepts being known as Kong Hyun, the most pathetic being in the universe, since the only thing he's managed since coming to the city was an internship, and although it sounded good on paper, it wasn't enough to live on, though his attention was focused on the game that was on. He didn't even have the energy to get up and turn it off. The only thing he wanted was for life to be as simple as a video game, one where he could get a good job as a swordsman or an adventurer, and with that thought, he ends up falling asleep. And meanwhile, planet Earth activates an ancient defense system. Detecting an anomaly, the hacker dimension is trying to cross the border from reality, but the invasion is stopped by the system responding automatically, placing the entire world into what they call the tutorial phase. And that's how Kong wakes up in a strange place, an empty space filled with floating light, and in front of him, letters appear suspended in the air, where he reads about the connection to the hacker dimension that will be completed in 4 years, being selected to participate in the tutorial of 8 stages in a place where dying is as real as living. And he can't give up, but if he manages to overcome them, he'll get his awakening. And with all that information, the boy tries to understand what was happening, just thinking it was the dream of someone with severe video game trauma who needed a lot of therapy, officially feeling like the family's disappointment. This served as motivation for him to take his work life seriously. Although that's a problem for tomorrow's Kong, for now he'll enjoy the dream, and so he entered the first stage, with the system wishing him luck in saving the Earth. His first mission was to face what he feared most, in a race to the end of a bridge. And although he didn't see any nearby, in a flash, he appeared on a narrow path of rock, along with many other people, and below them, a fiery river of lava stretched out, and the others wouldn't stop complaining about how strange this dream was, where everything felt too real. And beside him, Kong notices his sister June trembling and crying in fear, and he just sighs, annoyed because even in his dreams he has to put up with his nagging sister, with her thinking the exact same thing. And as they argue, June starts to realize that maybe this isn't a dream. It's too tangible, too vivid. Kong, on the other hand, stands firm in his theory, seeing everything as an overly realistic dream, comparing it to those times he dreams he's peeing, but wakes up dry. Information June would rather not imagine, and determined to stick with his logic, Kong. He takes the first step, confident that his NPC sister won't understand the mission, but she also saw the tutorial introduction and is just as scared. And he thinks that if he falls, he will simply wake up until someone in front of them stumbles and falls into the river of lava. The scream is so gut-wrenching it chills him to the bone. June, terrified, asks him if he still plans to go on, but Kong remains as cool as a cucumber. A very shaky, tearful June takes a deep breath to gather her courage and moves forward first, suggesting he do it by crawling so as not to lose his balance. And he, trying to maintain his dignity, ends up taking her advice. As they cross that narrow stone bridge, and June asks him if he understands what is happening. He insists it's just an absurd dream of a broke gamer, but June is convinced. Otherwise, feeling deep down that if she dies, there will be no waking up. Kong sighs condescendingly. Or so it seemed, because he was actually crying in fear as his sister wouldn't let him maintain his self-delusion, accepting his role as the pathetic older brother, trembling so much that he preferred to throw himself on the ground, believing deep down that if he just stayed still, maybe he would wake up. But a status window appeared in front of them both, announcing the increase in difficulty, just as everything began to shake. And the bridges started to collapse.
And June
Understood they couldn't rest and ran at full speed. Kong tried to keep up with her, and although the bridge wasn't as narrow, so they just had to focus on running to survive. When the end was near, rocks began to fall from the ceiling in June's path, and Kong tried to warn her. But seeing she wouldn't react in time, he jumped and managed to carry her to the finish line, thus completing the first stage, where Kong collapses on the ground, panting and soaked in sweat, while June calmly checks the floating system windows in front of her, while he's half dead. Waiting for, at least, a thank you, he just watches her in silence, but his sister is too focused on the window while he can barely make out blurry lines of text where he distinguishes a single word that stands out. Her skill, Hinata, was resurrection, and before he can process it, everything vanishes. And Kang's eyes snap open, back in his room, completely shaken, thinking for a second that it was just a dream. A very, very strange and intense one, but outside the world is starting to go crazy. The internet is flooded with comments and videos from thousands of people claiming to have had the same experience. Some describe dying inside that dream. Others, waking up with skills that shouldn't exist. And in a matter of hours, the entire planet changes, curiously turning fans of action manga and novels into the world's new experts. And it's all because of the connection to the hacker dimension, scheduled to be completed in 4 years. And so, both siblings rushed out, shouting about everything they had just dreamed. Since they were talking at the same time, neither could understand the other, to the point of getting tired and deciding to continue after breakfast. And while they ate, they checked social media and saw that the dream had become a worldwide trend. And at least the protagonist thought that dying hadn't been so bad, since many ended up falling. But Yun thought that with what she experienced, which was melting in lava, it should have left some trauma, although what worried her most was why they were both so calmly eating as if nothing had happened. And Kong eats, enjoying his food, analyzing that he doesn't have many options. And on one hand, just by opening the window to observe one of the possibilities. People hoarding products, fighting over toilet paper, others screaming that it's the end of the world. And some simply venting their fear by destroying whatever they find. And June, seeing all that, decides it's best not to go to work that day. For Kong, however, it's a normal day for an unemployed person, much more interested in the hacker dimension than worried about this. His sister notices he's not even paying attention to what's happening on the game screen, because he can see the countdown at any time, which currently shows less than 5 years until the fusion, and Kong calculates there's still time to prepare. But for now he prefers not to go out into the chaos, astonishing John as it's the first time his brother has said something sensible. The situation doesn't last long, just as Kong had imagined. The disaster dissolves in a matter of hours, and by dusk, everything goes back to normal, but that calm only lasts until nightfall, when they go to bed only to wake up again in the tutorial. And a window here on the screen offers him a detailed explanation of the system, which the protagonist simply skips to check his stats, letting out a smile, since he'll be able to use magic and sees his innate skill, resurrection. And he gets excited for the first time in a long while, thinking it was a broken skill, although it had a low rank that would allow him to revive 24 hours after dying. And he had to specify the place where he would resurrect, otherwise he would return right to the spot where he died, and he would also suffer a strong debuff after doing so. At least that last part doesn't apply inside the tutorial, getting overly excited about that skill, no longer feeling like a mere extra, and accepting to enter the next stage without imagining what was to come. Upon arriving, he found himself in a world where he had to wage a bloody battle against a goblin. Thanks to his video game experience, he managed to hold on, putting up a good fight in this stage where he had to prove his strength, brutally finishing off his opponents. However, upon holding the blood-stained weapon, he realized how different it was to take a life in a game. Compared to reality, he could barely contain his nausea and decided to leave, realizing he had been lucky to face a small opponent, until he was intercepted by another much larger and more fearsome one that was not at all happy to see its fallen comrade, and the terrified protagonist thought that if this supposed starter monster was this brutal, then tetanus would be the least of his worries, and the goblin lunges at him fiercely, with the boy managing to block the first blow. But he immediately realized that a flabby, out-of-shape body and a mace heavier than his own body was a terrible combination. and with his weapon flying from his hands, and the next instant is a hell of pain. The goblin runs him through 1, 2, 3 times without mercy, and so his body is already on the ground, trembling, covered in wounds, barely able to understand what's happening as the monster drags him, and from there, Kong can only think about how ridiculous it is to die like this. Not understanding why the goblin doesn't stop and, with a broken voice, he only manages to beg for help, knowing that no one was going to come, reflecting on the enormous amount of blood that a human being can have, counting every drop that left his body during the assault, and his agonizing torture inflicted by 4 goblins until he finally escaped in his last breath of life, and as Yun woke up startled and half dizzy, complaining because once again those crazy things won't let her sleep peacefully. Entering Kang's room, where she finds him a complete mess, wrapped in the sheets like a worm, with his eyes wide open and the 1,000-yard stare, which is enough for Yun to sigh and go to make some tea to avoid the scene, and later Kong is much calmer after a somewhat graphic and very unnecessary torture, and Yun prefers not to listen, although she also died in the dream, but hers was quick. Unlike the B-movie gore fest they set up for the protagonist, who between sarcastic sobs tells her that after something like that, even the bravest guy would call for his mommy, and seeing him like this, Yun sees that he's still okay because he still has his sense of humor, which is good because they don't need a psychiatrist, since the hospitals are full because of these dreams, although Kong is fine without therapy because he can't even afford it, and Yun looks at him with resignation, seeing the same unemployed guy as always, but at least he's alive, and tells him that according to what she's read, those who die in the tutorials simply don't advance to the next round, and Kong sighs in relief, thinking that he can finally sleep without thinking about lava, monsters, or pain, of course, until he closes his eyes and returns to the same place, and there he suddenly understands what his ability really means: resurrection. Letting out a very long censored curse, and after a long nap, he waits for the game to kick him out. However, hunger forced him to move, resigning himself to the fact that if he died, he would just come back here, so he decided to keep playing. But this time with a new strategy, his previous choice of weapons ended badly, so he swaps the mace for a crossbow to attack from a distance, and a spear for close combat, and ready to prove that the mandatory military service in South Korea was actually good for something. But apparently, in his case, it only left him with horrible aim, which he demonstrated when he tried to surprise the goblins, but all he managed to do was enrage the biggest one. Still, he didn't back down and charged with the spear forward, managing to knock down the smaller one, and thinking that this time he would win, until the spear got stuck and the big one crushed him, waking up startled in his bed, breathing heavily but at least grateful that this time he just died quickly. And so he continues repeating the same spot over and over again, cursing the system while changing weapons with each attempt and trusting in YouTube tutorials his last hope to stop dying like a noob, returning to the battlefield with renewed energy, only to wake up a minute later screaming again, promising to return and get his revenge, while John watches him from the doorway, full of secondhand embarrassment, and so he keeps going in and out of that world, over and over again, learning the basic sword movements, as if his life depended on it, and after 8 hours of constant training, he manages to raise his stamina by 1 point, although the effort leaves him exhausted. Checking his status window, he finally remembers that he still has 1 free point from the first game, assigning it to strength, hoping that this time it would finally be useful, and returning to the fight against the goblins, where this time exhaustion got the better of him, and he ended up dying immediately. Still, he kept insisting over and over again, balancing his training and moving forward steadily until he managed to improve his stats just enough to defeat the initial goblins. However, the rest of the horde mercilessly eliminated him as he was still exhausted and powerless. He continued training his scrawny body to the limit, and when he finally collapsed from exhaustion, he saw his efforts rewarded with a new skill. Even though it was F-class, the most basic and pathetic one that a swordsman could have, but with a savage smile, he returned to the battlefield, ready like a rabid dog to face the goblins once more, and Kong finally starts to understand how that stage works. First, he has to defeat the goblins in the fortress, and then take care of the 3 in the forest, and with that plan in mind, he moves forward and ambushes the first one with a crossbow, finishing off the second with his sword. Everything was going well until the last one showed up, who was giving him much more trouble, and they end up locked in a clash of swords that feels eternal, and the goblin tries to crush him with sheer force. But Kong manages to stop it with his shield, noticing that the enemy's movements are slower. As if his body was finally reacting, and he holds the clash with difficulty. But without giving any ground, and in the end, that swordsman's skill he had always considered useless was proving to be more useful than he thought. However, just as he tries to go for the jugular, his body begins to falter, and the goblin seizes the opportunity to easily disarm him and almost break his hip with a single blow. And Kong dodges at the last second, and luckily, he notices that the monster seems to enjoy causing suffering more than getting a quick kill, and he clings to that slight advantage. Using his best tactics, the dirty ones, first he blinded it by throwing dirt in its eyes and then took advantage of its distraction and threw a rock straight at its shin. The monster was left hopping on one leg, leaving it at the mercy of the protagonist's finishing blow, finally clearing the second stage. Celebrating as if he had defeated a final boss, and Kong gets up with his ego soaring and decides to celebrate. Preparing breakfast and moving around the kitchen with the pride of someone who just saved the world, though he almost chokes when his sister still half asleep. She manages to understand what he's babbling, and right at that moment the system shows a message. The tutorial has ended, now you can use your powers. Outside of the game, just in time for the appearance of the first dungeon, and then a huge gate crashes down in the middle of the street, and it's not the only one. Those same gates begin to appear all over the world, in plazas, stations, and city centers, and only the awakened can enter. And each one has a time limit to be completed. And the siblings do what any reasonable person would do. They lock themselves at home. While outside the world plunges into chaos again, and checking social media, Kong notices that those who turn 18 are being dragged into the tutorial, while John watches how people fear what will happen to the awakened who dare to enter the dungeons, and the protagonist thought they were exaggerating, just like everyone who was constantly checking their status windows. Something many complained about, and he tried to do it too. But in his case, his window wasn't fully working yet, since he hadn't finished the tutorial. And he asked his sister if she had any information about the third one. But she suggested he be patient, as there was almost no data available. Still, the protagonist, trusting in the results of his training, assured that this time he wouldn't be defeated in a shameful way, and immediately after he is being peed on by a monster. And we go back a bit to the beginning of the third stage, which turned out to be a test of patience and perseverance. The objective was to defeat the boss Gurkha. There was Kong, dressed in a full camouflage suit, who assumed that it was an infiltration and assassination mission. The problem was that he had no idea what kind of monster that Gurkha was, so before jumping in, he decided to check the rewards from the previous stage, using some points to level up, and he unlocked basic skills in swordsmanship, shield, and crossbow. All of that excited him, and although the descriptions seemed written to make fun of him, he decided to ignore them, spending extra life points, and checked his inventory, finding an old and worn-out sword. But he got excited as if he had just obtained a legendary relic. And with that, he convinced himself that he was ready to fight. To the Gurkha, and remembering his inspiration for the stage, it was Carlos Hathcock, the American sniper, who managed to eliminate his target after crawling for more than 1 kilometer, whom Kong ended up admiring upon discovering how ridiculously difficult it was to crawl for 10 hours straight through a humid forest full of bugs, and halfway through the journey, he regretted not having worn a diaper, because by the time he reached the target area, he was covered in bites, leaves, and many sticky substances, and at least he confirmed that his disguise was so good that it made him practically invisible. So effective that one of the guards even decided to empty his bladder right on him. And as the liquid fell on his suit, Kong felt his pride dissolving drop by drop. Trying to stay calm, repeating the stage's motto, patience and perseverance, holding on a little longer, until his dignity lost the battle and he launched an attack. With a single blow, he finished off the guard, although his feat had a small side effect. He woke up not one, but the entire enemy camp, surrounded, furious, and with no way out. He decided to at least go out with a badass line, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Come at me, you damn bastards!" Fighting with everything he had, making it clear that patience was not his thing. And although he fell in the end, he didn't leave empty-handed, accidentally unlocking a new skill, Lion's Roar of Fury, capable of lowering the enemy's morale and removing his own debuffs. And returning for his second attempt. This time during the day, he remembered his first humiliation well. So he knew that the strongest warriors left the camp during the morning, with only the weak ones guarding it. and taking advantage of the opportunity, he farmed them without too much resistance, convinced that maybe patience wasn't so necessary after all, and so he impulsively entered the chief's tent. Ready to fight, however, he found the Gurkha chief protected by two mages, who immediately paralyzed him, and the protagonist cursed how unfair that tutorial was. But he remembered his new skill with a savage roar, releasing his body from the magical energy and jumping through the air, finally managing to defeat the boss and clear the stage, thus setting a new record, and as rewards, a slight regeneration. The temporary title of Unbreakable, granted to those who show patience and perseverance. Although in his case it was the complete opposite, and after clearing Stage 3 in just 2 attempts, he began to think of himself as a prodigy, convinced he would finish Stage 4 in record time, or at least that's what he thought 1 month ago. And in the present, the news announced that they were still deploying teams to clear the dungeons, since only 40% had been completed. Additionally, the number of awakened continued to grow rapidly. And John listened to all this while alternating his attention between the television and the screams of his idiot brother, thinking he had died again, but no, this time Kong was emanating a powerful aura, celebrating that he had finally cleared the stage, destroying all the enemies, and a resigned Yun served him food and congratulated him on his success. However, her expression changed when she noticed something strange. After his last nap, her brother seemed to have returned with a number of healthy supplements, and although what bothered Yun the most was the face her brother was making, like he was a thug from a Japanese movie, and Kong only fueled her anger with his taunts, but that was exactly her goal, and after a few more taunts, she asked him how the 4th stage went. And according to Kong, it was a leadership test where he gets a group of NPCs with different roles and a clear mission to destroy the dungeon core, which sounds simple on paper but not for Kong, and from the very beginning the group was divided. One pair wanted to turn back, and another insisted on advancing, complaining about the lack of supplies, and after a long debate, they decided to move forward, and Kong felt proud of himself. He had managed to motivate them, keep morale high, and lead the attack with his new regeneration skill, intermediate, that allowed him to heal wounds in exchange for magical power. And I listened to him, doubting that something so easy had taken him a month. And right there is the reason for Kang's frustration, since on the very first night of the stage, the couple in charge of guard duty decided to run away together. But before leaving, they eliminated him just in case. What burned him the most wasn't the betrayal. It was that they had the shameless idea of flirting in the middle of a dungeon. And June, somewhat annoyed, tells him to at least finish swallowing before continuing with his romantic tragedy. And he, very politely, listened to her and, after swallowing, resumed the story more calmly, telling of the multiple similar betrayals he suffered in each repetition, until after many attempts he found the most reasonable option. Eliminate everyone before they could betray him, and so we returned to that day. The group was arguing again about whether to advance for the reward, or retreat to avoid dying, but this time Kong shouted angrily, pointing his sword at the first traitor. With a deranged look, he warned them that if they followed his orders they would die, and if not they would die, and if anyone complained, they would die. And one dared to protest, and, just as he promised, he beat him frantically until he was unrecognizable, and then calmer, suggested they follow him if they didn't want to end up the same way. And, thanks to his experience, he managed to maximize his stats with brutal efficiency. After a tough battle, the protagonist finished off the last of the skeletons, astonishing everyone because he had actually done it, and Kong finally observed the dungeon's core. And with a clean cut, he completed the 4th stage. And despite all that minimal suffering, he obtained a large quantity of valuable materials and items. Among them were skeleton magic stones, and although he doesn't know what they're for, in addition to a cutting skill, a ring of magic resistance and mental attacks. But his greatest achievement was another. In the real world, he had gotten really ripped, to the point where calisthenics no longer gave him results. So he decided to start lifting weights. However, his training was interrupted by a message on his phone that alerted the residents of his area about a dungeon break right in that city. The goblins had unleashed a terrifying massacre, and, from his building, Kong watched the chaos, remembering with horror that his sister had gone to work and, in desperation, he looked for a weapon, realizing that, unlike in Latin America, in Korea they didn't usually keep machetes stored away, so he grabbed the first sharp thing he found and ran to the location, screaming with all his might to attract the goblins' attention, and although he couldn't use his abilities outside of the tutorial, he at least achieved his goal. They all pounced on him, and he scoffed at them, seeing how simple and weak they were. Although deep down he wasn't sure if it would be as easy as in the tutorial. And he discovered that not only were they that easy, but they were also too predictable. And with a smile, he thought he was going to have some fun. And meanwhile, in the building where Yun worked, a pile of office furniture was blocking the entrance. Every blow from the monsters made the door vibrate with each strike. They thought their time was running out, and in that office was Yun, trembling, not knowing how much longer the barricade would hold, and amidst the noises, she heard her brother's voice responding. Fear had her paralyzed, with her brother's messages asking if she was still there, and although she couldn't answer, because just then a blow shattered the door to pieces. And everyone, terrified, saw a horde of goblins crossing the threshold. But amidst the dust and debris, what appeared was something just as terrifying. Though at least it was a familiar face, her brother with a fiery gaze, and a rather unsettling smile, and she felt a deep sense of pity. Seeing her barbaric brother standing among the rubble, while the department head was furious because Kong had destroyed the barricade that was keeping the monsters out, and he, somewhat embarrassed, apologized for the damages, but clarified why they no longer had to worry about the goblins, and so everyone was stunned to see the long line of beasts he had left fallen behind him, and Kong suggested that they take up arms, assuring them that the goblins weren't that difficult, and to follow him, much to the confusion of the group. Explained that he had seen a large number of creatures gathered outside, so he assumed there were more on the other floors and proposed clearing the entire building. And after the chaos, June healed her brother's wounds, who, being a bit stubborn, was reluctant to waste water on it, but considering how badly injured he was, he had no other choice, and she couldn't understand how he could be so strong and take so many hits at the same time. And Kong explained that he had gotten so used to regenerating in the game that he would forget to dodge, but now, without his powers, that was a problem. And June, worried, reminded him that if he couldn't use his abilities, he couldn't revive either, so she asked him to stop going overboard. When he stormed the building, which, as cool as it might have seemed, was only cool until he had a heart attack. Still, some of the office girls saw him as a total catch, so she asked him what his type was, to which he excitedly replied that he just wanted someone who could put up with a man who curses from dawn till dusk, showing off all his woman-repellent charm, and, without realizing it, he closed his eyes for a moment and was back in the game. This time he was on stage 5-1, a trial where he would have to display all his wisdom. In front of him was a group of beautiful girls, and the mission was simple in theory. Among us style, he had to figure out which one of them was the succubus. The problem was he only had one clue. Succubi drain men's energy and are incredibly beautiful, and Kong looked at the group in front of him and knew, without a doubt, that he was screwed. Until one of the girls approached with a mischievous smile and asked him who he thought the title of succubus belonged to, and Kong, dazed, could barely say anything coherent. Luckily, his magic ring glowed, warning him that an enchantment attempt had been detected. And that night, as the NPCs set up camp, Kong sat by the campfire, thinking about all the times he had died in such a pathetic way in the previous stages, and for the first time, the situation didn't seem so bad. Looking around, he sighed in silence, thanking the gods for such a well-deserved break, though he had to hold back a victorious smirk because he didn't want them to see it. The succubus would notice, thinking of using one of the NPCs. However, he ruled out the male ones, since men were vulnerable to the charm, but he decided to rest a little before taking action. And upon opening his eyes, he saw a familiar ceiling and screamed like a madman as he had returned to June's office. And the others were grateful that he woke up, because they could finally leave, happy that the army had arrived. And Kong barely heard them, frustrated for having lost again, until he understood. He approached the window and watched as the military wiped out the goblins, with everyone there finally feeling some relief. Everyone seemed calm, except Kong, when suddenly his body tensed, overcome by a sense of danger that he couldn't explain, but that instantly gave him goosebumps. It didn't take long for him to notice he wasn't the only one. The soldiers were starting to get restless when, despite the bursts of gunfire, the monsters kept appearing without pause. Some cursed under their breath, remembering that this was supposed to be their last mission before retirement, which was a clear bad omen. And then, one of them opened fire on a red goblin that stood out among the others because the bullets bounced off its skin, and with the monster approaching step by step, before it ripped his head off with a single movement, and chaos was immediate, while From the building they saw how an entire squad was wiped out in seconds by that creature that advanced with unstoppable fury. The soldiers unloaded everything they had, but the goblin didn't even flinch, jumping between them, and with one swipe of its claws sent several to an early retirement in the sky. And with everyone terrified upon seeing the grotesque scene, including the protagonist, who fixed his gaze on the terrible monster that seemed to be staring back. And in one of the other trucks, the soldiers were trying to react. Still not understanding what the hell had happened, they called for reinforcements over and over again. But they only received confusing responses. Nobody knew what had hit them, until they saw it on top of a truck. The red goblin watched them with a sadistic smile, licking its lips as if it were already savoring its next meal and, terrified, the soldiers insisted on their request for backup, but the response was not what they expected. Since they would be sending a trained civilian, and seeing their position, all they could do was face it with some dignity, so one of them took a deep breath and aimed his rifle to give it his all, but the weapon jammed, leaving him at the mercy of the monster that advanced without stopping, enjoying the panic it caused. And then, a block of concrete flew through the air at full speed, hitting the red goblin right in the face, sending it flying through the air, courtesy of Kong, who arrived just in time to save the soldier, who was still trembling with pure panic, and upon seeing Kang's gaze, he considered him more terrifying than the goblin itself. So he reflexively tries to shoot. But the rifle is still jammed, and Kong raises his hands to calm him down and makes it clear that he is a human, although the soldier finds it hard to believe, and in the end, he accepts it, trying to apologize, and Kong reassures him, clarifying that he didn't save him for being a good Samaritan either, but that earlier, upon seeing his eyes, he understood something simple and terrifying. If the soldiers fall, the next stop will be his sister's company. So he prefers to face it in the open field, and asks him to stop shooting because the bullets could hit him, and instead of ammunition, he orders the use of tear gas bombs. The man suggests that he at least put on a mask. But there's no time for that, and Kong insists that he throw them now, warning him that if he fails, they will both be dead. The soldier nodded and ordered the street to be cleared. And then the red goblin got up, roaring furiously, while Kong prepared himself to unleash all his trauma, and just as the soldier threw the gas grenades, Kong soared through the sky and landed right on top of the monster, covering it in a dense cloud, and the gas irritated its eyes, making it cry as it swung its weapon in desperation. Which was exactly the protagonist's plan, who was also crying, but he knew that goblins, when they felt cornered, would become desperate. And for a creature with such tough skin, that was perhaps the first time it had ever felt pain. A pain that Kong knew all too well, disarming the monster, and began a frantic and unhinged attack. Amidst laughter and tears, and despite all his effort, he doesn't succeed. Pierced the enemy's skin, and the soldier watched in amazement, thinking he must be the awakened one they had talked about. But no, the real awakened one arrived just at that moment, shrouded in an electric flash. Confused, he looked at the scene, believing that Kong was another support companion, and as Kong paused to catch his breath, in disbelief that so much effort hadn't managed to even scratch the monster, thinking of using some special attack, but then he remembered, annoyed, that he only knew how to slash. Luckily, the new awakened one lunged forward, moving at an impossible speed, cutting everything in his path, except for the red goblin, who withstood the blow without even flinching, and seeing that the newcomer admitted that this would be more difficult than he thought, he turned to Kong and signaled to him that if he was also an awakened one, he should help him find the enemy's weak spot. And so, the two of them quickly coordinated, attacking relentlessly, pummeling the red goblin with blows and slashes, while trying to keep it cornered. However, Kang's stamina began to run out, and his sword ended up breaking in two. He desperately searched for another weapon among the rubble, while the other awakened one kept the monster busy with his speed. And finally, Kong reached for a spear and wielded it, observing the enemy's incredible toughness, which still showed no signs of damage. He tried to think of some vulnerable point, and, without knowing exactly why, he remembered an ancient move, straight from Naruto's ninja handbook, managing to strike directly at its rear using the deadly 1,000 years of death technique. Although, seeing the move from the outside, he felt a certain embarrassment for using it, and with the strange, damp sensation that ran through the spear, Kong tried to convince himself that the rear end was technically its vital zone, and without knowing how he reached that conclusion. And, because his body executed its next move, lifting the monster from the rear to slam it down hard, and, as if defiling one hole wasn't enough, he decided the other weak spot was its mouth, thus ending its suffering. And despite everything, the Awakened One is impressed by the way Kong fights, not understanding how he hadn't met him before, so he ends up believing he must be a freelancer. And Kong, for his part, notices that the system is showing him a new item. Although he has no idea what it is, because the tutorial hasn't finished, he takes it anyway. And he gets ready to move on when the other guy tries to say something since he wants a share of the loot, but Kong decides he has no reason to share it. Since he was the one who did all the work, leaving it full speed and suggesting he take the spear he used against the goblins as his share. And the other guy, desperate, just stands there, still processing what happened, and takes off his mask and looks to where Kong disappears, not fully understanding what kind of person he just met. And after the fall of the Red Goblin and the arrival of Twilight, everything seemed to return to calm. And so, he and his sister walked through the dystopian streets left by the attack, until they reached their sweet home at nightfall. Completely destroyed because Kong didn't lock the door. And Yul snapped that her brother, whose brain muscles still hadn't grown, decided that first they would clean up and then eat something if there was anything edible left, and while they were having dinner, proving why it's not a good idea to look at social media while eating. She almost choked when she found a viral video of her brother's fight with the goblin, apparently recorded from the buildings nearby. In it, hundreds of comments praised Kang's skill, which made him put on the expression of a deranged pervert that his sister could no longer tolerate, and he complains that she always criticizes his handsome face, and ended up reading the comments where everyone agreed he had the face of a crazed villain, although with an impressive physique. And during the night, Kong, already tucked into sleep, asked his sister to turn off the light. She refused to encourage such laziness, but given her brother's childish insistence, she gave in just because of the difficult days they had been through. Still, she warned him not to scream in the morning, and the confident Kong assured her that this stage would be a piece of cake, offering to buy her a beer when he would finish it, and June doubted that beer would ever arrive, but at least he hoped he wouldn't scream, and so the protagonist prepared to sleep peacefully. It seems that before he could, his mind filled with memories of the powerful Awakened One, who had helped him, aware that many had passed all the stages, while he had barely reached the second one. He was just average, and although he downplayed it, he decided to finish the tutorial and become the strongest. And as he was about to fall asleep, thinking like a total simp about seeing the cute succubus who had caused his game over again, and he took the chance to feast his eyes until he opened them, and got a huge scare, which he tried to erase with a single blow. Confused, he tried to understand what was happening with the system, which indicated that this time he had to finish off a horde of gray goblins. Bad hearing, Kong. Without paying much attention to the details, he just wanted to know why the tutorial had changed while he fought, waking up and screaming again, much to his sister's annoyance. Meanwhile, in a kind of trashed internet cafe, a man almost had his face erased by a single punch, and from the floor. He couldn't understand how a simple human without the tutorial had been able to defeat an Awakened One. The sadistic guy, on the other hand, looked at him with contempt, convinced that these individuals, although a bit stronger, were pathetic at fighting. However, upon seeing the protagonist's video, he couldn't help but get excited, feeling that finally there was an interesting Awakened One, and Kong checks the next tutorial mission and discovers that he has to find a doppelganger, a monster that blends in with people and devours someone every night. He's confused because the idea is basically the same as the succubus game, except there's nothing attractive to look at, and he tries to think of a smart strategy. But in the end, he just ends up shouting to get everyone's attention, acting all tough, warning them that from now on, whoever moves is the monster, and his brilliant plan goes terribly wrong, with everyone else teaming up to eliminate him immediately. Waking up frustrated, aware that he's terrible at Among Us type games. So he tries to ease the annoyance with food, but the constant feeling of failure will last for a full 1.5 months. And finally, one day, he decides to try using his head, although his brain couldn't come up with a better idea than to greet his sister in a tough guy cosplay, not the best he could think of. After spending 53 days stuck on stage 5, where the constant change of scenery doesn't help him and thinking clearly isn't his strong suit. So, he has no choice but to trust in the power of clothes. Although his sister's look is one of clear embarrassment, believing it's more likely they implanted a smart person's brain in him than for him to have become one himself. And Khan, resigned, accepted that revelation while she suggested that instead of spending money on his costume, he should soundproof his room so she wouldn't have to hear his screams. And that night, Kong entered the game again, prepared for whatever absurd mission he might get. Ironically, the system assigns him something quite simple: Clear a dungeon full of giant spiders, only having to find its weakness, and with that, he excitedly advances through the cobwebs and monsters until he reaches the boss. For the first time in a long time, he's grateful that the task didn't require him to think too much, and during the fight, he goes all out, but ends up taking the full brunt of the creature's poisonous breath. The poison spreads through his arm until it becomes unusable, and, without a moment's hesitation, he gets rid of it and keeps fighting, sliding under the spider's body and cutting it with a single slash, completely fulfilling the mission's true objective, finding its weakness, by eliminating it with pure brute force. And seeing the destroyed monster, he assumes the mission is complete without having used his head for even a second, obtaining his new skill, giant strength, which increases his physical power, very much in line with his idea that thinking was a waste of time. And meanwhile, at school, a boy is waiting for his friend to invite him to celebrate his birthday. The problem is that his friend is still stressed out by the tutorial, exhausted after barely passing the first stage, and with no reliable information about what happens from the 5th stage onward, which only 1% of people manage to pass. And yet it seems like someone is actually succeeding and only has one stage left to finish. But their advice was questionable. In the 3rd stage, they recommended intimidating your companions, and in the 5th, using your muscles, Plato style, and for the following stages, it basically suggested applying brute violence without discriminating between enemies or allies, and that's why no one in the comments could believe such theories, and that they just so happened to come from the protagonist, who was furious that they were disrespecting his genius. And his brother didn't understand why he was yelling at his phone. And he replied that no one was listening to his brilliant ideas. And John just made fun of him, seeing him argue with kids online. But Khan insisted that his method was perfect and that when he passed the 8th stage, he would become like Han Xian, leader of the Dangun Guild, or like Choi Donggu, president of the Ability Users Alliance, and his brother couldn't believe he was comparing himself to geniuses who had completed the tutorial in a single attempt, while he had been repeating it for months, and that annoyed him, retorting that he had managed to pass 2 stages in a single day, and would finish the last one that very same day. And so, night came, with Kong ready to face the 8th stage, and unleashing his reward for clearing the 6th stage, the amazing sword Vilgain, the faithful companion of the famous mercenary of the same name, who carved his name in blood and glory with that very weapon. Over time, the sword became imbued with a sinister energy that granted the berserker skill, and he also obtained Ronald's armor, belonging to the legendary Knight Ranty, which, after being repaired hundreds of times, had learned to repair itself. Excited to use such cool artifacts and show them off one day in the real world, now he only had one more stage to clear. However, this one began with a strange question. What are your beliefs? And Kong, confused, didn't understand what that meant when suddenly the whole place began to shake. The ceiling shattered and the floor crumbled, making him fall into a huge void, waking up in his pajamas. But he wasn't in his room, he was in the middle of crowded streets. Surrounded by a city that seems alive and in motion, he surprisingly doesn't take long to realize that something is wrong, just as a girl runs right through him, noticing that his body has no physical form. However, the scene was so ordinary, so similar to Earth, except for one detail that changes everything. The people around him are not human, they all have basically the appearance of reptilians, but being a civilization identical to the human one, and suddenly the gaze of a young reptile locks onto him unsettlingly, making him think that he really can see him, but suddenly the boy's expression changes, showing a look that Kong knows very well, a mix of fear and resignation that makes it clear that something huge is approaching, and looking back he understands a horde of beasts emerges from the dungeons, destroying everything in its path. The crowd panics. Everyone runs, screams, and stumbles, but nothing can stop the creatures, stronger and more savage than anything Kong has ever seen before. And before him, the city collapses in seconds, far surpassing the chaos of the break he witnessed during his own dungeon break. This being a truly apocalyptic scene with the system appearing in his vision, showing the countdown. And Kong understands everything. This is what could happen in his own world if no one stops it. Immersed in the chaos, he felt an even more ominous presence. A huge, indescribable being descending upon the city and extending its hand. The terror was so great that even the monsters fled, and although Kong knew it was just an illusion, He trembled at the feeling that he would be crushed by that entity, being split in two. However, he woke up again, this time in a world of complete light, without understanding what was happening. And there, a luminous and transparent being welcomed him. Kong in turn approached, asking if he was in front of a god. The being smiled and clarified that it was not, but rather, it held the highest position in that dimension. It was an administrator. And this being is in front of him, admiring him, trying to understand the situation. In what seems to be a job interview, more than a divine trial, and with its employees willing to answer his questions, so he starts by asking if that scene he saw earlier could be repeated on Earth. And the answer he receives is that everything will depend on them. His annoyance grows at the thought that such a powerful being would do nothing to protect the planet. And the being makes it clear that it's not his role to do so. He isn't there to fight, but to maintain balance, and that's why things exist. Like the status window and the tutorial. Kong is at a loss for words. And the being then changes the subject and starts asking him directly about his beliefs and why he decided to get to this point. Kong avoids answering, convinced it's a pointless question, but the being insists, explaining that since the beginning of the tutorial, his curiosity about humans has been growing, and that he sees them as creatures driven more by emotion than reason. And that condescension annoyed Kong, who with a sarcastic smile replied that if he were such a good observer, he would have already noticed that humans simply are born seeking to be a little happier each day, surviving however they can. The being then asked him if there was anything he wanted to protect, and Kong answered firmly, his spoiled little sister and his parents. The being wondered if that made him a hero. But Kong, after so many traumas, prefers to avoid heroic troubles, and the administrator knew it, since he had observed that his talent for being a hero was practically non-existent. Still, he confessed to enjoying watching him, admiring the way he had faced the tutorial. And Kong thought he was dealing with a sadist, and with that in mind, he asked why the fifth stage of wisdom was constantly changing. But the being avoided answering, and just like that, anticlimactically, stage 8 came to an end, while Kong complained as he started to float. And the being assured him that more trials awaited him, and that, whether he liked it or not, he saw him as the great hero who would save humanity. The protagonist, on the other hand, just wanted to get revenge for being left without any cute girls in the tutorial, while he was being transported out of that dimension with the luminous being, hoping to see him again, and with the echo of Kong promising revenge being the last thing that echoed in his mind before waking up screaming. Or at least trying to, because he was choking on something. Everything was being watched by his little sister, who had anticipated his screams and had covered his mouth in a rather unorthodox way. And, with her brother complaining that she did it with a sock, although at least it was clean, she coldly replied that if he was going to complain so much then, he should stop screaming, assuming from his expression that he had failed the tutorial again. So his credits would probably last a good while longer. However, Kong showed a smile that was abnormally wide as he summoned his status window, showing off to his sister how strong he had become, although she was just looking at the air, but she decided to believe him. Still, she reminded him that if he had graduated, he should start earning money and hurried him to breakfast. The protagonist felt that had been a very cold congratulation, understanding why his sister was still single. Her response was a spatula straight to his face. And later, the girl left for work while he continued checking his status window and was somewhat disappointed by the rewards obtained after completing the tutorial, although at least now he could add titles to his stats, in addition to several new skills but what really excited him was finally discovering what that mysterious item was that he got from his fight against the goblin, a magic explosion book. This left him so excited he had to scream, although after 4 months in the tutorial, he had learned to do it silently. And Kong decides to learn the new skill without a second thought, and also considers that it was time to enter the skill training school. And in another part of the city, a young woman named Anna Milo was walking enthusiastically toward her first day as a public official, having just been assigned to the Awakened Skills School, the place where they get certified those who managed to complete the tutorial. And, despite its short existence, the institution is already considered one of the best in the world. And for me, seeing the recent graduates begin their hero's journey was something inspiring. Or at least it was until she ran into Kong, whose first impression left her on the verge of tears, having such a harsh expression that he looked like an ogre. With her flustered, trying to ask for his identification, a single gesture from him was enough to make her back away, hiding behind the posts, trembling while Kong looked at her without understanding what had just happened, or why everyone around started to look at him as if he were a criminal. being labeled all over the place as a dangerous guy who made girls cry, and at that moment the instructor arrived. Kim Ijun, the blonde guy from the Goblin incident, although now wearing glasses, who immediately recognized Kong. And Kong also identified him by his voice, and Kim observed him carefully, surprised by how much he had changed from his registration photo. And Kong blamed his skill for his new appearance, assuring him that he was still himself. Even so, the instructor noticed something strange. His level was too high for someone who had just finished the tutorial, suspecting that Kong had cleared a dungeon illegally. The protagonist, seeing that not even by lying about his level could he dispel the doubts, decided to keep lying, claiming that he had entered before it was considered illegal. He even invented a unique skill that supposedly doubled his strength, and, intrigued by his apparent cooperation, he pulled him aside from the group to ask him about his other skills obtained in the tutorial, and Kong agreed. And biting his arm, he showed the first one, regeneration, then he showed him a ring, and, finally, unable to use his real skill, resurrection, he improvised by saying his other skill was the roar of a lion, asking if he wanted a demonstration, and Kim, somewhat curious, gave him free rein. Meanwhile, in the line, among the other recruits was the sadistic guy, who had awakened, immediately recognizing the protagonist as the man from the Goblin incident. Just when Kong unleashed his roar, the sound shook the entire compound, even startling Kim, who was impressed by his immense strength and immediately decided to take him personally to the management. And all of this was watched by the fascinated sadist, who was smiling from ear to ear, overexcited by such a spectacle, and so Kong, in his distorted view, felt like a total stud on his first day, even though he almost made a girl faint from fright. Also thinking about how close he came to being denied entry to the school until he proved that his talent was too obvious to ignore, and now he's attending his first class, where everyone recognizes him, but not for something good, but as the monster who shouted so loudly that he knocked a small girl unconscious, leaving his popularity in the gutter, although he doesn't seem to care too much. And the one who does seem interested in him is the blonde sadist, and when the class begins, Kim enters and introduces himself as the one in charge of the training, that they will have 10 days of theory and practice, and that if everything goes well, everyone will pass without any problems, adding that since the world changed, more and more dungeons and monsters have been appearing, and that the old methods are no longer useful. This means that what they learn today might become useless tomorrow, and Kong listens and thinks it sounds overly pessimistic, but he gets the point, and Kim only wants one thing, for his students to be able to live. And when the first class ends, Kong feels exhausted from boredom. He doesn't think he can endure 10 more days of the same, and then a huge, muscular guy approaches him, introducing himself as Whack and offering a handshake. The protagonist finds him annoying, but returns the gesture anyway, unaware that it's all part of the muscular guy's plan, who seeks to caused a commotion in the line when he shouted so loudly it made everyone's ears hurt, and quickly notices that his grip doesn't work because Kong activated the giant strength skill, increasing his muscle strength to counter the grip of the huge muscular pig, who starts to feel his hand being crushed little by little, damaging his macho pride after having put all his stat points into his strength, and tries to resist to avoid looking ridiculous in front of the class that is already watching the strange fight intently. And he increases the pressure to the maximum, tensing all the veins in his arm, pumping blood like crazy until he can't take it anymore. And a sharp crack breaks the silence, as his arm is the one that explodes, splattering blood everywhere. This makes the sadist from his seat almost jump with excitement as screams of agony echo throughout the building, which are replaced shortly after by ambulance sirens. While in the principal's office, he tries to explain what happened. According to him, the muscular guy asked him for a handshake and, while doing so, started to scream until suddenly his arm exploded. And although Kim finds that hard to believe, the protagonist maintains it's the truth, adding that he could have ended up just as badly if it weren't for his strength ability, increasing his power by 1.5 times, and Kim noticed that he had changed the details regarding the ability he mentioned before, but Kong blamed his terrible sense of numbers, and the blonde guy, who had serious doubts, decided it wasn't worth arguing anymore and sent him back to the classroom. And so he returned to class tired from his strange day that just kept getting stranger. When the sadist asked to sit next to him, introducing himself as Yuziang. Apparently, he was looking for an older brother figure since he was a recent middle school graduate, something Kong doubted. seeing him as too old and terrifying for his age, and confirming the terrifying part when he asked him for details on how he made the arm explode, but he insists it wasn't his fault. Meanwhile, Kim returned for the second class, where he explained that the dungeons are classified into two types, regular and incomplete. The former were the most common and, if not cleared, would break for weeks after they appeared. Incomplete ones, on the other hand, could break at any moment, which is why they had to be cleared quickly by destroying their main core or by entering the core's secondary measures to delay the breach. And in the middle of the explanation, another muscular guy interrupted him, expressing that he didn't need to listen to so much useless chatter to kill monsters, and Kong was the first to complain, claiming that the most macho and muscular guys were brainless. He always interrupted the class without realizing that he had just described himself, and the guards try to calm the guy down, but Kim decides to challenge him to step forward. The guy, noticing the confidence of the instructor, accepts the challenge. Without thinking, and on the podium Kim poses a clear challenge. He will give him 1 minute to attack him, and if he manages to graze him, he will graduate immediately, and if he fails, he will be expelled. The muscular guy, trusting in his strength, accepts without hesitation, and from their seats Kong and the sadist watch the scene attentively, with smiles twisted and terrifying, and the big guy accepts the challenge, materializing his sword, while the guards watch, worried about Kim's safety. But he, unfazed, adjusts his glasses, waiting calmly for the challenger who lunges with all his strength, and Kim dodges the blow with mocking ease, making it clear that his attacks are too obvious, making the big guy's blood boil, who takes momentum for another furious slash, but Kim not only dodges it, but appears behind him, insisting that he is too sloppy to fight. And so he continues to easily dodge each and every one of the violent movements, criticizing his terrible swordsmanship. And exhausting the big guy's patience, he lunges with all his might, not only failing this time, but according to Kim, by throwing his whole body into a move like that, he greatly neglected his defense, proving it with a kick that disarms him. But his biggest mistake wasn't even that, but attacking so recklessly. He simply wastes energy quickly. Kong observes the scene and compares it to a showdown between a professional boxer and a novice. However, what he has just witnessed is far above that. Kim's speed and precision leave him impressed, and even though he has improved a lot, he can't help feeling the urge to face someone like that one day. An idea that makes him look too much like the madman sitting next to him, whom he ironically judges for looking like a psychopath, thinking that by being next to him, they might think he's a weirdo too. And as evening falls, they move on to physical training where Kim hands out weapons and tells them to participate however they want, so he can correct them later, and who finds it boring from the very first minute, and instead proposes something more interesting, a match between them. The idea excites him, to the point of letting out a crazed smile, but Kim interrupts them before they can start, making it clear that he can't fight yet. And resigned, Kong just watches how terrible most of them are with a sword, thinking that he doesn't need to practice, although he decides to warm up a bit to show off his moves. And instead of impressing anyone, one of the instructors interrupts him to criticize his stance and the poor execution of his strikes, and Kong gets more and more irritated to the point of wanting to challenge him to a duel, though only in his imagination, because he doesn't want to get into trouble. Even so, he manages to get Kim's attention, who asks for silence and attention to do a demonstration, choosing the protagonist and the instructor who had scolded him. One will use the correct stances, and the other will do whatever he wants. And the duel will be a single move, and both prepare and lunge at the same time, and Kong unleashes superhuman strength, so great that the guard can barely block. But the impact is so strong that part of his weapon breaks in two and leaves him on the ground, completely defeated. Kim declares the match over and addresses everyone, explaining that the goal there is to survive. Learning technique is important, but what's essential is reaction time, making it clear that nothing they learn is absolute. The protagonist, with his chest puffed out with pride, felt like a role model, although he didn't fully understand what the instructor had meant. Meanwhile, Kim apologized to the instructor for putting him in that position, although the latter assured him it had been a good learning experience, even though the blonde man had actually done it for another reason. He wanted to test something about Kong. And meanwhile, Kong had started a training journal, in which he recounted how he had crushed it on his first day, gave a bully what he deserved, and had met Yu as a kind guy, who was clearly a bit crazy, also mentioning how boring all the classes were to him. And the second day was practically the same, except that Yu seemed a bit more unhinged than before. And during the third day, everything followed the same pattern, so Kong resigned himself to having only one friend, a somewhat unstable one, whom he still wanted to fight someday. On the fourth day his mood worsened, and he ended up being reprimanded for his lack of motivation. On the fifth day his frustration grew, unleashing his anger during training. Fed up with everything, and so the sixth day arrived, when he shamelessly suggested to Yuz that he cause some kind of scandal. Ironically, he was the one who had warned Yuz not to cause trouble, or they would be expelled, and Kong simply said he didn't care if he got expelled, leaving his companion surprised by the coldness with which he said it. Still, he reassured him, assuring him that they could have sparring matches soon. His intuition told him that something interesting was about to happen, and when training came, Kong quickly defeated his opponent and moved on to the next one effortlessly and back in his seat. Yuz congratulated him, but the protagonist seemed pleased. He considered fighting such weak rivals to be child's play. And observing the rest of the participants, he noticed a generally low skill level and doubted he could endure staying there until the end of the course. However, something quickly caught his attention when, in the middle of the fights, one of the participants lost control and was about to kill his opponent. The opponent closed his eyes, resigned, not seeing the weapon stop just inches from his face. Thanks to Kim's quick intervention, who ended the fight and called for the next duel. And Kong, impressed, could only admire Kim even more, who had become the only adversary he truly wanted to face, and shortly after, it was Yuz's turn, who just before going up on stage, he shot Kong a smile that deeply unsettled him, as he had no idea what he was planning. Still, he thought that with Kim supervising, nothing serious could happen, and the match would be between UCI and a girl named Li Yuri, a mage who would be using her personal weapon. According to the rules, that was allowed, and Yuz had no objections, although Kim noticed that he had swapped his sword for a mace, but the sadist made it clear that it was within the rules and Kim approved it. So he asked them to keep their distance to begin, and the mage attacked first, creating sharp quartz stakes that shot out towards Yuz, who shattered them with a single, almost carefree, move. Everyone was astonished, including Kong, who excitedly watched the use of real magic. Still, he didn't understand why Yuz had never shown that power during training. For her part, a frustrated Li summoned a huge quartz crystal, intending to end the fight in a single blow. Yuz, however, didn't even seem to pay it any attention. His gaze remained fixed on Kim, and, as the quartz crystal drew near, he took a strange stance. Han immediately noticed that something was not right, and in a single, swift, and calculated move, Yuz spun around and deflected the attack's trajectory, sending it directly towards the instructor. Kim dodged the projectile without difficulty, but he understood that Yuz's goal hadn't been to hit him, but to distract him, and in the next instant, the psychopath lunged at the mage, covering the stage in blood, leaving the entire place in silence as everyone watched in dismay the brutal scene that ended with Yuz celebrating his victory with completely unhinged joy. Desperate screams filled the air as everyone rushed to help the girl whose arm had been shattered under Yuz's satisfied gaze, which he didn't even try to hide, and an enraged Kim drew his sword and confronted him, barely containing his rage. But the psychopath, as if it were a childish prank, claims it was an accident, and with no other choice, Kim just orders a break while they attend to the young mage, and he speaks with Yuz in private. And from his seat, Kong observes the instructor's dagger, recognizing it as the same one he saw that time with the Red Goblin, and the next 2 days went by seemingly normally. The training sessions continued, and Yuzeong started participating again, although this time under the watchful eye of Kim and all the attendees, even though nobody really wanted to face him since they were the only fights with an assigned emergency healer, which are really expensive. However, the protagonist, given the tense situation, had no better idea than just 2 days before the event of graduation to suggest to Kim a practice match with real swords. He looked at him in disbelief, seeing that after his group had caused so much stress, he came up with this crazy idea, and without even having the decency to knock before entering. But Kong knew that deep down, Kim was also bored, as if a demon were tempting him. He tried to convince him by reminding him that they had met before. And finally the demon on his shoulder convinced him, arriving at the training battlefield with Kim, preparing for a duel, and the latter thanked him for his help. That time, although Kong just felt relieved that he didn't notice the item he stole, what Kim did notice was a sword, which didn't seem like it belonged to a level 5, and Kong told him he had just found it lying around, but Kim didn't believe a word of it. And yet he decided to respond in kind, unleashing something he just found lying around, his daggers. In a matter of seconds, an imposing presence appeared behind Kong that the protagonist barely managed to counter, and this is the shadow, as he notices that it's not just about brute force, but about precise reflexes and impeccable coordination, and Kong warns him that focusing too much on a single stat would make him vulnerable, hoping he won't hold back. Reminding him of his regeneration ability, Kim accepts the challenge and disappears in the blink of an eye, kicking off a fierce clash, and both move with an intensity that makes the air tremble, and Kim can't believe Kang's resilience, who seems to enjoy every impact with his regeneration, keeping him on his feet. And Kim tries to take advantage of the slightest opening to attack directly at the neck, but Kong smiles right before the blow lands and raises his arm, catching the dagger between his bones, and in a brutal move, he pulls Kim straight into a headbutt that knocks him down, leaving him on the floor staring at the ceiling, accepting defeat. And later, with an ice pack and a beer in hand, both enjoy the post-fight silence, and Kim acknowledges Kang's strength, and the latter returns the gesture by calling it a draw, since they had agreed to fight without skills, and the blonde says with a half-smile that this makes him the winner by disqualification, which provokes protests from the protagonist. And in the end, Kim laughs, admitting that the fight helped him relax, but reminds him that they need to rest because tomorrow they have dungeon practice. And right at that very dungeon, which was supposed to be heavily protected, a mysterious figure was standing in front of it, turning his body transparent and moving forward until he passed through the threshold to open the dungeon. And the next morning, Kim introduced the group to the designated F-class educational dungeon, Gelk Forest, warning that it contained strong monsters and some traps. Although, of course, those creatures would be their only concern. He also explained that, by nature, they were somewhat reclusive, so they wouldn't face large hordes, and added that he would explain the rest as they went. As everyone began to enter, Kong watched the enormous gate in amazement. It being the first time he had ever entered a dungeon, feeling a strange sensation as he did so, marveling at how impressive it was. However, he approached his only friend to ask him if, in theory, he could go back through the same gate, and Kim reminded him that they had already covered that in class, although just 2 seconds later, he asked him to get away so he wouldn't be lumped in with the crazies. When, ironically, he was the one who had approached, and Kim called his attention to begin the demonstration, taking charge of luring a monster, and as they went deeper into the forest, the instructor continued to explain what kind of creatures they would be facing, which were basically a type of ostrich with protein sulfate acid. They were strong enough to dent armor, which is why everyone was so heavily armored, and they had to follow the standard strategy, surround it with several people and attack its legs. Everything was going routinely until it was announced that the dungeon core was collapsing, about to cause a break, and Kim immediately ordered everyone to evacuate. Although the dungeon sky was starting to crumble, the instructor handled the situation like a simple evacuation, remaining calm and waiting for everyone to exit calmly through the portal. And once outside, Kim began to count them, but the others were confused about who had managed to enter the dungeon without authorization. However, right behind them, the portal began to turn murky and collapse, so he sent his assistants to call for reinforcements, ordering everyone to get out immediately, and Kong arrives on the scene without fully understanding what's happening. And unfortunately for him, and luckily for Kim, the instructor needs recruits to contain the situation, and apparently if the dungeon core is removed without defeating the final boss, a full break doesn't occur, but a collapse does, releasing hordes of monsters. It's something he had already explained in class, although Kong, true to form, never paid attention, and Kim notices. But he has no time for scolding or jokes. The monsters are about to come out. Or rather, they're already out, and, without a second thought, Kim puts Kong in charge of the defense while he organizes the counterattack, turning what was supposed to be a simple training exercise into a real battle, and Kong, completely lost regarding the procedures, is left alone in front of the chaos, having no idea what to do against the enormous horde pouring out of the dungeon. But at least he'll have some fun, and although in the end they stole his first kill, courtesy of Hughes, who had already crushed a monster with his mace, enjoying the sensation with a disturbing smile that makes our protagonist cringe. He thinks that he does recognize that the guy knows how to fight, so, resigned, he joins the combat, thinking that at least he has the psychopath on his side. And so they began to tear through the monsters, with the protagonist suggesting that his crazed companion cover his ears so he could let out his epic lion's roar, although he followed it up with a not-so-epic phrase. Still, the objective was accomplished. He managed to lower the enemy's morale, which caught the attention of Kim, who along with everyone else, noticed the monsters were weakening, assuming it was one of Kang's skills. Thanks to that, it seemed like the situation wouldn't become problematic. Unless something worse happened, and Kang took the opportunity to test his magic explosion, blowing up a monster, and almost his own hand as well, thinking that skill was too dangerous for anyone without regeneration. Although he thought it was cool, and the protagonist refused to tell him where he got it, and the sadist catches his attention again when the last thing to emerge from the dungeon was a colossal bird that embodied Kim's very fear. He, upon seeing it, watches with a grim expression, understanding that without reinforcements, he doesn't have much of a chance, knowing full well the power of the two lunatics in front of him, and still doubting they could face a real boss alone. However, the insane duo only thinks of one thing as the beast marches towards them, deciding who will be the first to fight. Now, one day from graduation, a woman requests from Kim a detailed report on the recent incident. He immediately assumes that the dungeon terrorist has struck again. However, the woman's real curiosity isn't about the attack, but in the recruits who stood out the most, and Kim is clear on that. The two notable ones were precisely those who destroyed the poor Geikal boss. The first, Kang, a recruit with stats bordering on inhuman. His healing ability removes his fear of death, making him completely unpredictable. And the second, Yuz, a cold and calculating combatant with a natural talent for fighting, though tainted by his sadism and cruelty. And the woman is astonished by the almost logical tone of the report and assumes Kim has already tried to recruit them. He denies it, mainly because it would be unethical, not being as shameless as his boss Han Se-yun, the leader of the Dangun Guild, who insists he leave his teaching position and return to the guild, especially now that things are starting to get suspicious. And the next day, the graduation event arrives, presided over by a nameless director whom Kang sees for the first time, to Kang's surprise, who thought that Kim was the boss there. And later, upon leaving the event, an elegant man waits for Yuzeong in a limousine, with Kang amazed that his companion is not just some crazy strong guy, but also a crazy rich one, who is now offering him a ride, which he quickly accepts. But before he gets in, Kim stops him, and Kang thinks the instructor is feeling nostalgic, but the blonde guy isn't one for sentimental gestures. He just wants to inform him that the rewards for his help during the battle are being processed, and that they will be contacted soon to receive them. And with that said, he left, although Kang perceived it as a very cold farewell. Kim, somewhat annoyed, clarifies that with how strong Kang was, he would see him again soon in some dungeon. Still, he warned him not to forget the responsibilities that came with his new power, as he was now an official awakened, a license that Kang proudly carries, showing it off to his little sister. However, she barely pays attention, the very person he was convinced couldn't keep ignoring him. Once he became a hero who cleared dungeons, although ironically he didn't even know how to get to one, until John, surprisingly more informed, explained to him that everything was on an app. Huh. The protagonist is surprised that she was so smart, but John simply read it on Facebook, starting to fear that all those muscles were eating away at her brother's brain. And while he was checking the app, confirming that indeed all the data was there, locations, rewards, and recruitment, thinking it would be a good idea to go find a dungeon and earn some money to show off to his mother, since dungeons turned out to be a profitable business, not because of the items that could be found inside, but also because of the cores, true energy gems that generated excellent income. And the news talked about nothing else, just as Kang's father was watching, proudly remembering that 1 month ago his son had obtained his Awaken license, and his wife also remembered that he had recently sent them a bag full of money, and the news that he bought a used car. And the father feels happy that his son is already earning more than him, while the mother can't help but worry about the type of work he does. Still, the man maintains a clear philosophy. Better to be dead than unemployed at his age. Besides, he thinks the prettiest girls are always approached as a team, and that his son is no fool, with both of them agreeing that they raise someone intelligent, calm, and wise. Coincidentally, right at that moment, his son was completely alone, massacring monsters with reckless brutality, laughing in the midst of the chaos, while turning the battlefield into a bloody spectacle. And meanwhile outside, his used and reliable car, Batley, was parked very close to the dungeon entrance, receiving a call from his mother, who was worried from home because he hadn't answered all day. And his father, on the other hand, tells her to let him sleep, although he also asks that if she manages to talk with him, to tell him to help with a little problem in front of the supermarket, seeing a damn dungeon that just appeared, although his wife reminds him that this is a job for the government, but her husband says their son already works in that field, so he can at least take advantage of it to speed up the process. However, it seemed it was already too late, because from the dungeon gate, a large number of orc warriors began to pour out, as well as a colossal final boss, and thus, with the arrival of dawn, the protagonist, victorious after having cleared the dungeon, was planning to go immediately for an E-class, although he finally used his brain and decided it wasn't worth finding out if his resurrection ability worked in the real world, preferring to go and rest. However, upon reaching the car, he found 30 missed calls from his sister, and upon calling her back, he only heard John giving him some news that left him completely frozen, and while the news reported that they were trying to control the Ongrave dungeon break, cordoning off the entire area to prevent further damage. However, there was a growing fear for the safety of the people trapped in the affected area. And given the gravity of the situation, Dangun offered to be part of the rescue operation. All of this was happening while Kong was preparing to leave. And his sister, worried, tried to stop him, insisting that he not go alone, but he was confident. He assured her it would be easy for someone like him, but an annoyed Jum asked him not to get carried away by his ego. However, Kong reassured her, promising that he would be fine and would return soon with his parents. And upon reaching the containment line, the military blocked his path. And everything changed when a senior officer ordered them to let him pass, explaining that they needed every available awakened one, though he clarified that it would be at his own risk. And Kong accepted without hesitation and took off at full speed, although he quickly proved to be a terrible example by checking the news while driving. On it, he read that 5 dungeons remained open, so he prayed for his parents to hold on until he arrived, hoping that no monsters would appear nearby. And as karma for not paying attention to the road, he failed to notice a huge boar that brutally rammed him, causing a spectacular and violent crash, and despite the disaster, Kong emerged unscathed, though he was furious about the fate of his trusty battle. He decided to get revenge, preparing to face the animal. But the roar of the enormous beast made him reconsider, and on top of that, a deafening rumble was heard from behind him, announcing the arrival of a huge stampede of orcs. And so resigned, he thought that maybe he had been Goblin Slayer in a past life, because they always seemed to have something against him, and so he opted for the best possible revenge, forgiveness, and a full-speed escape, leaving the furious boar behind, which soon had to deal with the goblins, and that's how the protagonist freed himself from the 2 threats, without needing to fight, although also without getting his revenge. And now, without his car, he had no choice but to resort to the old and reliable 2-foot express, running tirelessly until night fell, still far from any source of electricity, so he couldn't use his cell phone much, and to top it all off, he had taken the most deserted shortcut he could find. And as if the night wasn't long enough, a threatening presence approached at high speed. And Kong reacted on instinct and managed to cut its head off just in time. And the body fell to the ground, revealing a kind of dog, capable of turning invisible, being the type of creatures that surely would make him lose sleep, especially because an entire horde of those beasts appears around him, moving through the shadows, and Kong raises his weapon, determined to face them head-on, making his way through them without any strategy, with a demented smile and the desire to have a little fun before dawn. And when the sun finally rises, the protagonist is sleeping peacefully on a tree branch, surrounded by dozens of bodies of invisible wolves, though he is sore because the mattress of branches was quite uncomfortable, stretching before getting back on his way. And in the meantime, his mother reads the message he had sent, assuring her that he would arrive in the morning, and she is holed up with her husband, trying to convince themselves that their son will be fine, and both of them fear that he is risking too much for them. The father, although he trusts that Kong can handle a horde of F-class orcs without any problems, can't help but worry about the new monster that has appeared. A huge, muscular, ugly, and completely deranged being that seems to enjoy the slaughter without any remorse, which is none other than his own son, sinking into a savage frenzy, feeling ready for them to embrace their kind and adorable son. And Kong feels that defeating F-rank orcs is almost boring. But everything changes when the orc warriors appear, realizing that the dungeon was not a higher rank, shouting with all his might, calling out to his parents, and assuring them that he is there to save them, but that they shouldn't come out for any reason. And inside the house, they hear their son's voice, echoing from the throat of the monster roaring outside, unable to understand what happened to him in those months, as the protagonist starts the fight, clashing against the horde in a burst of energy and violence. The battle is chaotic and, to gain advantage, he channels a magical explosion that takes down the first one, but he still has to face the other two, managing to block them although the impact shatters his wrist. Even so, he counterattacks with fury and pierces one with his sword, lifting it into the air and throwing it against its companion, knocking them both down before smashing their heads with a brutal blow. And panting, he stands among the bodies, celebrating his victory, but only for a moment. Because out of nowhere a tide of orcs appears surrounding him, and behind them a giant orc that dwarfs the others, standing out from the crowd, and Kong stares it down, with no intention of surrendering, even though he knows he's cornered, and he sacrifices his magic of healing in favor of pure destructive energy, unleashing the giant's power. And the lions roar to push his strength to the limit, ready to face the monster, prepared to win, or more likely, to get his face beaten in. And the blow sent him flying, and although he got up, it was only to be used as a punching bag. Aware that they were destroying him effortlessly, as if they were simply having fun with him. And each impact left him weaker, until his body stopped regenerating, leaving him with only his resurrection ability. But even so, something inside him pushed him to keep going. With his face shattered and his vision blurred, he refused to fall as long as his family was in danger, running back into battle, screaming with what little strength he had left, and suddenly, he stopped when he heard his mother's screams. She watched in terror as the orcs managed to climb up to her window, and Kong ran desperately to save her, pushing as many enemies as he could out of his way, but he couldn't advance. Much before the giant orc stopped him only to be smashed brutally against the ground, and still lying there with his head cracking. Under the enemy's pressure, he tried to get up, but his strength was failing him. However, his will remained firm. He wanted to protect his family, although his sight began to blur, and in that instant, a cutting gust tore the general to pieces, without its attacker even breaking a sweat. It was Jean Xian, the leader of the Dangyuni Guild, who had arrived with her team, and one of her subordinates informed her that the area was already clear, and she asked about the residents, and they assured her they were safe, although they were still evacuating the injured, and the woman assessed the scene, lamenting the damage, but her subordinate added that thanks to someone managing to draw the orcs' attention to that spot, they had been able to save many people. And Jean sighed sadly, lamenting that this person had died resisting until their arrival, ordering that honors be paid to his body. However, when they tried to look for him, he had already disappeared. And then Kong woke up on his uncomfortable little branch, believing for a moment that it had all been a dream. However, soon, he understood that it had just been his resurrection skill, which had sent him to the last place he slept. The price was clear: a death boost that reduced his levels and half of his stats for a full day, but none of that mattered to him when he remembered that 24 hours had passed since he left his family in danger, and he decided to return at full speed. Even though his body barely responded due to the effect of the debuff, still he forced his muscles and started running, praying that everyone was okay, and after 5 hours of an exhausting and painful run, the suffering only increased upon arriving in his hometown. The scene was heartbreaking, his home destroyed in a scene that struck his soul. Thus, completely in shock, he wandered aimlessly among the remains of what were once his memories. And finally he came across a military unit that helped him make contact by phone. It was then that John gave him the terrible news. His father had lost an arm, and his mother was in a coma. And so 2 months passed. The news spoke of the continuous battles of the Dangun Guild, whose leader Zhang expressed her concern about the appearance of dungeons that were getting more and more difficult. And meanwhile, Kong was preparing to leave for a new dungeon, and his worried sister tried to stop him, reminding him that he had already died 3 times, but he wouldn't listen to her, and no matter how much June tried to support him and free him from his guilt, her brother remained deeply affected. And inside the dungeon, a blonde guy easily takes down a giant ant, being the ace of a small group of awakened ones, and he was recognized for his strength, but more for his arrogance, because he liked to remind everyone that he reached stage 5 of the tutorial, believing that everyone around him is useless, although he congratulates them in a condescending way. But everything changes when he sees Kong rushing through the tunnel at full speed. The others try to stop him, warning him that he's heading straight into the monster nest, but he doesn't listen, and the group, fearing he'll die, decides to follow him, and the curious blonde agrees to go with them. to see just how far that madman will go. They arrive at a living hell where an army of giant ants covers every corner, and Kong stands before them and activates his secret skill, Wane, which makes his entire body vibrate, increasing his strength by 40%, though it also tears his muscles apart at an alarming rate, and he waits for the right moment. And when the creatures surround him, he launches his attack and his body moves like a storm, leaving within minutes the ground covered with lifeless insects, and the group watches him in complete silence, astonished to see how the madman who walked past them turns the nest into a graveyard, and inhuman brutality. And Kong, on the other hand, only thinks about how useless his new skill is, which, while powerful, he also knows that without his regeneration, he would be dead, feeling the burning in his body and his muscles trembling, but smiling as the leader of the small group approaches, genuinely worried about him, but he doesn't even answer. He just takes the dungeon core, completing the mission and leaving, with the group members wondering if he isn't going to collect the loot from the monsters, but he's not interested in that for the moment, walking away without looking back, while the voices of the group echo behind him, celebrating the treasure they just inherited, without having done anything. And later, as they walk down the same hallway, one of the girls breaks the silence, saying that the man didn't seem to be okay, but the leader didn't care, suggesting she should just be grateful he left them so much easy money. And some of them think he might be the lone awakened one who clears dungeons on his own, and the blonde guy laughs at the idea, convinced it's absurd, because no one could clear an E-rank dungeon without a team. But the mockery dies down quickly when they reach the main chamber, where the final core had disappeared, and the dungeon begins to seal. The protagonist, for his part, looked at the reward he obtained, the Antria's Carapace skill, a defensive technique he was hesitant to use, since he barely had enough magical energy to maintain the skills that he really cared about, thinking there was no point in having 1,000 powers if he did not learn how to use them, and he remembered how his outburst during the fight with the orb had cost him dearly. But, clearing his mind of regrets, he returned to his true goal, becoming stronger, starting with mastering that new skill. And outside, several reporters surround the group that had just come out, throwing questions about the mysterious solo player who cleared dungeons, and the arrogant leader simply points to the protagonist who is just coming out of the portal, completely dirty and exhausted, looking for a break, but as soon as he takes a step outside, he is completely blinded by a storm of flashes, with the journalists pouncing on him, filling him with questions like his name, his story, and some even try to recruit him for their guilds, even though Kong just walks through them, pushing one of the reporters who gets in his way, and this one is ready to complain, but upon meeting Kang's gaze, his cold and threatening expression makes him back away, terrified, and the rest just watch him leave in silence, until everyone's murmurs begin to resonate, assuming he is some kind of gangster. Meanwhile, Kong, annoyed by the attention, heads to his car, wanting to leave the noise behind, but before he can, a smiling man approaches him before he can get in, speaking politely, introducing himself as a representative of the Ability Alliance of Xian, and hands him a card, stating that they have been watching him and that they recognize his potential, which is why the Alliance can offer him unlimited support. The protagonist listens without responding, and the man keeps a smile and asks him to at least think about it. And he calmly walks away, leaving the protagonist in silence, holding the card with a look of distrust, and he tells us that he knows the Alliance, which is different from traditional guilds, as its goal was to promote the rights of the awakened. However, he did not expect to be approached in that way, so he decides he'd think about it later because now he needs food. And while he was having lunch, a little girl stared at him, terrified by his appearance. Although Gang didn't even notice, still absorbed in his thoughts, worried about his lack of mana to maintain his skills. He searched online for some items that could help him, but he didn't find anything useful, until he found a story that caught his attention, and so he traveled to a distant town, where there was a dungeon known for its goblins, famous for dropping items that increased mana, where it was thought that if they defeated the boss, they could get a huge mana buff. However, that dungeon had not been cleared because it served as a good place to farm and earn money, but recently a group of criminals had taken it over, preventing anyone from accessing it. And the government, as always, did nothing, waiting for some guild to clear it, and according to what Kong read, the powerful groups were taking control of several dungeons to manipulate item prices, and they eliminated anyone who disobeyed their orders. And even though the place looked desolate from the outside, he entered without hesitation, but he had barely advanced a few meters when he ran into three guys who were annoyed and claimed the dungeon in the name of the Bite Guild. warning him that if he wanted to live, he had to hand over all his belongings. Kang's response was to send him flying with a single blow. The other two, confused by the state their companion was left in, were paralyzed for a moment, yet they still bravely attacked. And Kang easily stops one of their swords with his bare hands, shattering it into pieces and throwing him to the ground, amusing himself by kicking him over and over again with a huge smile. And suddenly, a mana explosion hits his back, causing no damage, but it was annoying mostly because he could never figure out what magic explosion techniques could be used at that distance, so as a thank you for the lesson, he approaches the girl who launched the attack, taking her hand and giving her a lesson on how destructive it can be. That skill, and the result is a sharp crack and a scream from the girl with the shattered hand, and Kang is sick of wasting time on such insignificant matters, but the break is short-lived because a larger group appears furiously, threatening him and proclaiming that they are in the territory of the Bite Guild, with the MC being glad that so much trash showed up, because he needed a slave to guide him through the dungeon. Speaking of which, the leader of that group recalls how the arrival of the tutorial changed his life forever, turning the world into a place ruled by the survival of the fittest, full of violence, ambition, and greed, and in such an environment, even a simple cog in the machine could fulfill all his whims, just like that guy. Now, one of the executives of the Bite Guild, with his arrogance through the roof, assured the MC that he wouldn't get out of there alive, and the moment he finishes the sentence, the next thing you see is a huge fist slamming right into his face. And an instant later, he's on the ground, motionless, almost lifeless, just like all his companions, and an annoyed gang complains that one of them managed to stab him, pulling the dagger from one of their bodies and, with absolute calm, announces that whoever manages to get to their feet will have the honor of being his guide. And so, with everyone trembling, Gang ends up choosing a low-rank rookie named Song for the role, demanding a round of applause in a rather unorthodox way, which comes across more as a threat than a command. The bandits desperately ask him what he'll do with the rest, and Kang gives a friendly smile, assuring them he'll let them go if they promise to be good people, and everyone nods without hesitation. But their leader isn't so lucky, as the MC pummels him mercilessly in front of the horrified gazes of the others. It's clear he doesn't trust the word of a bandit, and repeats the process with each one of them, leaving them half dead until he's left with just his lucky guy, who is at least still breathing. And as they move forward, Kang observes how huge the dungeon is and begins to suspect that the guide is just stalling for time, and Sun, nervously, tries to justify himself, saying they are taking a monster-free path, and Kang complains that it's boring without monsters and orders him to change course towards a more dangerous area. However, when the boy agrees, he contradicts himself, because night is falling and he'd rather eat. That's how Sun, as his personal cook, turned out to be very good while they ate. Kang asked his age and what he did before becoming an awakened. The boy, barely 20 years old, told him that he was a university student and that he had ended up there out of necessity, since he has to pay off student loans and can't find a job. Furthermore, his father's business went bankrupt, forcing him to look for easy money. But before he could continue, Kang interrupts him, aware of how dangerous it is for extras to tell their tragic stories. And later, Kang slept peacefully while Sun, nervously, gets up in the middle of the night thinking about trying to eliminate him, but after thinking it over, he decided it would be better to escape. However, no matter how stealthy the fugitive tried to be, he was discovered instantly, and the boy pretended he was just going to the bathroom, but Kang, without bothering to move, replied that he could do it right there, warning him that if he tried to escape, he would literally die. The next morning, Sun leads him directly to the Goblin Village, where the main hub of the dungeon is located. And Kang believes him upon feeling the strong concentration of magical energy in the air, something the rookie cannot perceive, not missing the chance to mock him for it, enjoying his discomfort, while Sun just grits his teeth to hold himself together, enduring for just a little longer, because he knows that all the goblin forces usually gather around the core, sending out patrols on a regular basis, and his guild used to take advantage of that information to stock up. But with no recent attacks, there is only one possible conclusion. All the goblins are gathered there waiting for the intruder, and according to him, Kang was signing his own death warrant, and the protagonist, in contrast, smiles with excitement as he watches a huge horde advance towards him and Sun. Seeing the disaster coming, He drops his luggage and bolts, running at full speed, wishing he would never see that lunatic again in his life. And Kan, for his part, yells that when he's done, he'll come to eliminate him. And the boy runs until his legs give out, panting and soaked in sweat, thinking it's impossible for anyone to survive that until the sound of the system makes him stop dead in his tracks as he reads that the main core of the dungeon has been destroyed. Stunned by the portal opening in front of him, Sun can't comprehend how a mere human could wipe out the entire concentrated force of a dungeon, knowing that it takes an immense amount of firepower to wipe out such a number of monsters, and, at first glance, Kan doesn't seem like that type of guy, showing us how Kan charges forward like an unleashed beast, with his devastating strength sweeping away everything that moves, leaving the dungeon carpeted with bodies. And even with his exhaustion, his unbreakable stamina keeps him moving, even with his body covered in wounds, refusing to fall on his way to the final boss. He was right in front of him, fulfilling all the characteristics that, according to Sun, a dungeon conqueror should have. And the only thing he was wrong about was thinking there was strategy in his movements, since the protagonist lets his body be painfully battered, with the intention of ending everything with pure brute force. And in the end, he achieves his goal, a ring that increases his mana and magic recovery. And so, with that, he considers the job done and decides to find his guide, the traitor. But a surprise awaits him outside. The entire Bite Guild is blocking the exit. In the crowd, he makes out the faces of the guys he had knocked unconscious earlier and, of course, Sun and Kong. He smirks, ready for the massacre. But before he can move, the crowd parts. From among them emerges a refined man in a dark suit and a polished expression, who calmly approaches, apologizing for the trouble caused by his subordinates, introducing himself in an elegant and cold tone, like John, the leader of the White Guild, who arrived to offer him a deal. But Kong immediately interrupted him, demanding that he get to the point before he lost his patience, and the leader, without losing his composure, proposed that he join his guild, certain that with his talent he could quickly rise through the ranks. The protagonist rejected him immediately. John, still smiling, held out a card in case he changed his mind. The protagonist's response was to tear it to pieces in front of everyone, making it clear that although he usually acted like a gangster, he would never stoop so low as to join mere criminals. This managed to irritate John, who confronted him directly, but Kong didn't back down, exchanging tense glares, although in the end John decided to let him go for the moment, assuring him they would meet again, and Kong walked away without looking back while Song watched him with a mix of fear and admiration, thinking that man was as strong as he was unpredictable, not noticing that something was silently approaching from behind. And meanwhile, the protagonist was driving his car, satisfied that his buff had worked, fully aware that if John had decided to fight, he probably would have died, regretting that he couldn't take care of Song. But he was sure he would see him again, and that they would settle their score then. And back in the dungeon, one of the men Kong had beaten accused Song of being a traitor for having led Kong to the core, and the leader, upon hearing this, drew his sword. The young man fell to his knees, begging for his life and promising to obey any order, but the leader only gave him a fatal wound before kicking him into the dungeon's unstable portal, which closed right after his body fell through. With that done, John ordered his second-in-command to investigate everything possible about Kong, who was already being watched, and the guild leader understood that he couldn't face him directly. So he planned something more perverse, to go after what was left of his broken family, determined to break his pride and crush his spirit by attacking his weakest points. Meanwhile, at a steakhouse, Yuna admires how her brother had gone from being an unemployed college grad to treating her to fine cuts of meat, hoping he was still investing his money well, but apparently, he was burning through his savings and asked about his mother and sister. Optimistically, he told him that it seemed she was going to wake up soon, which made the protagonist happy, which in turn made his sister happy, who was tired of seeing him so incredibly gloomy. Although he claimed he used to smile very often, but she wasn't referring to that psychopathic, demented smile he always wears. And right at that moment, he had to answer nature's call, and got up from the table, even though you told him the meat was ready. And he apologized, as it seemed he hadn't been able to go for days, since the dungeons weren't comfortable for doing his business, and with John receiving too much information. And so, a few pounds later, he came out of the bathroom and found his sister talking to a guy in a suit, who apparently was asking for him, just as she seemed to point him out. While the stranger left and Ken arrived right after, thinking that someone was hitting on his sister, but she clarified that they were looking for him and had left a note. The protagonist had no idea who it could be, but after reading the note he was shocked it was a greeting from John, and in the end, they both got home safely. Then his sister wanted to go out and buy a beer, but the protagonist preferred to go in her place. Upon leaving the store, he worried about what that guy was planning by approaching his family, thinking about quitting the dungeons to protect his sister. Although he doubted the guy would dare to do anything right away, and just then he gets a call from his father telling him that his mother finally woke up. The news is a relief, but the excitement doesn't last long, because his father adds that a friend of his came to visit, although he doesn't have many, and that friend is none other than Guyon, which filled the protagonist with a colossal rage. And meanwhile, on a busy street, two girls who seem to work in the same office run into each other. One of them is the shy Milo, and they're talking for a bit before bumping into another girl who is wearing armor and offering them coffee. And they both accept, thanking her for the gesture. But when the girl leaves, they both agree that she's a weirdo for always wearing her armor, but also an angel, although when it comes to people, Milo seems to have experience, still lamenting that dreadful encounter with the psycho who crushed hands and the other one, a giant and terrifying one, who looked like an ogre that still gave her nightmares, a dream that is apparently so vivid that he's right behind her, noticing him when they lock eyes with that emotionless being, leaving both of them with no other choice but to let out a piercing scream and beg for the police. And Kong tries to talk to them, but they don't stop begging and screaming, but he begs them to tell him where Kim is so he can protect his family, and although it doesn't help that he talks like a caveman, he at least gets Milo's attention, who explains to him that he is not on duty. Apparently, Kim has returned to his guild to give a lecture on dungeons, when a frantic guy comes to interrupt him, warning that in the lobby there is a voracious monster who apparently knows him, and so Kim attended to the monster before him, clarifying that it was fine to be nostalgic, but that he didn't think they would see each other again. In this way, trying to understand why he was there. And Kong immediately asked to hire his services. Kim, grateful that he was getting straight to the point, wanted to know for what. Kong replied that he needed him to protect his family, while he destroyed the Bait Guild. The blonde was amazed by the trouble he had gotten himself into. Although he knew the Bait Guild well, he still admitted that he currently couldn't do anything against them, and the protagonist offered to take that problem off their hands, and Kim admired how direct he was, although he didn't understand why he had sought him out among everyone, and it's because the protagonist recognized him as the strongest person he knew. Although Kim reminded him of Yue's and Kang's existence, however, he had enough brains not to bring that psycho near his family. Besides, he didn't even have his number. So he begged Kim to take care of his family for 1 week, promising him good pay, but the blonde warned him that he already had an excellent salary and position in his guild, so he couldn't negotiate with money, and the MC, a little excited, thought he was being asked to negotiate with his body. And Kim, on the verge of a stroke for letting Kong lead the negotiations, so he made it simple. He just had to agree to see his boss, and in exchange, he would get the guild's official help, and apparently he accepted because both at the hospital and at the company where Yun worked, they had already assigned trained awakened ones. However, Kim doubted that the MC could face the Bait Guild alone, although it was already too late to think about it, as they were literally 1 block away. And from there, the MC was impressed by the guild space when comparing it to Dangan's, but Kim warned him that their power wasn't in their building, but in the strange number of dungeons they had conquered, suspecting they must have some kind of powerful weapon. Furthermore, he pointed out that Kong, in his desperation to protect his family, had announced exactly when he would arrive, losing the element of surprise. And, at least it had given him time to recruit Kim and his men. And so, the MC handed him his cell phone along with his car's location, which Kim interpreted as a farewell, but Kong assured him that even though it seemed like it, they would see each other again, and without a single scratch. Walking to the front, where John, backed by his huge guild, was waiting for him, and Kong felt there were too many people for a simple reception, although John assured him that his entire new family had come out to greet him. Those words made Kong fill with rage, responding with a very Korean play on words. That ended with him calling them a bunch of bastards, shouting fiercely, activating his bug, charging all his explosive energy into the ground, cracking the concrete beneath them, and although the impact annoyed the entire guild, they knew that it wouldn't bring down the metal framework of the structure. However, Kong had prepared something else, mixing his strength skills, punching the floor, until it collapsed, causing everyone present to be crushed by the rubble, with the protagonist emerging completely unharmed thanks to his shell ability, giving the okay, but he didn't have much time to rest when John appeared behind him, who wasn't upset in the slightest. He simply requested that he acknowledge him as a partner, but Kong couldn't forgive him for approaching his family. The gangster apologized, although he insisted that the alliance could become very powerful, capable of overthrowing Dangun and the arrogant John, with whom he seemed to have a personal grudge, and Kong felt that all this talk was already making him lose his patience, and no matter how much John kept trying to convince him, assuring him that there were only 200 men there and many more nationwide, only needing one more face for the guild, a powerful fighter who would guide them to take over the world, and Kong interrupted him with a gag that ended with him spitting right in his face. Sick of listening to a speech from some low-quality YouTuber. Speaking of YouTubers, subscribe. And John, seeing the mockery on his face, finally lost his patience, looking down on him as a mere commoner, although the protagonist felt that insult seemed to be from another century, and even more so coming from a wannabe gangster who was getting more and more irritated, ordering all the men left on the upper floor to attack, unleashing a rain of spells on Kong, and thanks to his skills, his items, and a furious shout, he managed to repel the attacks, intimidating everyone present, and John, frustrated by the lack of results, shouted at them to stop holding back and to go for the kill. The guild members, encouraged by his words, gathered their courage and launched their best attacks against Kong. The protagonist decided to test how resistant his shells were, planting himself firmly, tanking the impacts that kicked up dust, while the warriors began to descend to finish him off, not noticing that he was waiting for them with a smile, determined to enjoy the extermination, gathering all his power, unleashing two colossal explosions that shook the building, echoing outside, and when the smoke cleared, Kong remained standing on a pile of charred bodies, still surrounded by enemies. And the leader taunted him, saying that this made him a murderer just like them. And Kong coldly replied that he was only paying them back in kind, surprising the leader of Bite, who looked astonished that such words came from someone on the verge of death, claiming that Kong was completely exhausted, barely able to move, as shown when he failed to escape a spell that trapped him, immobilizing him with energy chains. Yet he was still smiling, even as a warrior appeared behind him, ran him through with his sword, the light in his eyes slowly fading. Kong accepted that it was all over, having held out much longer than he expected, and John thanked his second-in-command, letting him rest while he personally finished the job, honestly amazed by the resistance the enemy had shown, admitting he wished things could have been different, but he knew you couldn't reason with those beasts. Still, he allowed him his last words, and the protagonist, with a mocking grin, only wished for John to find a hair in every soup he ate, which was his final provocation before. An enraged John grabbed his face and set him on fire, leaving him to die slowly in agonizing flames, leaving him as a human bonfire, while ironically lighting a cigarette, listening to his subordinates lament the great losses their guild had suffered at the hands of a single man. Annoyed, he ordered them to collect the equipment and items from the body to at least recover some of their losses. But when they went to look for it, the body had already disappeared. And so, Kong was resurrected once more, with John witnessing a now familiar scene, accustomed to seeing him emerge that way, only warning him that if he was going to get everything dirty with his armor, he would have to clean it himself. And just like that, 2 days passed, while the Bite Guild stood guard over a dungeon, waiting for some unsuspecting fool, whose gear they could steal. However, the rumors about them had made them more cautious. Because of this, everything seemed quiet until suddenly someone began to approach slowly, and it was a masked lunatic. It was clearly the MC, who apparently finally understood after dying again that just rushing in without any plan was not the best idea. Using the analogy that you can't destroy a rock with an egg, even if you had an infinite supply of them. And with this, he realizes he can't keep dying because of the penalty. So now, he must use his head to dismantle the Grimovite, one by one, and so the story flashes back to the moment when a strange masked man was destroying the guild's first dungeon, and the only survivor, who was conscious, was grabbed by the neck while desperately begging for his life, asking for forgiveness over and over again, and the masked man, not fully understanding why he was apologizing, threw him to the ground and handed him a pen, demanding that he write down the location of all the dungeons controlled by their organization, and the man, trembling, obeyed without hesitation, and Kong, not satisfied, wanted to know how they kept getting rid of people without the police intervening, unless they were in on it, and the poor wretch, trembling even more, confirmed that they were, although he didn't know the details. And with that information, the MC obtained the complete map of the dungeons. So grateful for this that he gave him a pat on the head, a rather explosive one. And with that done, and seeing that the government wouldn't lift a finger, Kong made his decision. He would become a true monster. Luckily, the Bite Guild's attempt to divert attention only caused public opinion to view them with a mix of pity and confusion, especially after it was confirmed that monsters existed which did not come from dungeon breaks. And Guyon, still deep in the chaos after facing that lunatic, was interrupted by a subordinate who burst into the room completely frantic, only to receive an ashtray straight to the face, a punishment for entering without knocking, especially when his boss was in a terrible mood, yet the subordinate managed to give his report. The lunatic had attacked again, and already had more than 100 casualties within the guild. Hearing this, John understood the critical position they were in, deciding to send more troops to the dungeons, even if they had to sleep right there to maintain control. And when the subordinate left, John was lost in thought. 5 days had passed since they finished off Kong, and although his body had disappeared shortly after, a madman appeared attacking their bases, which was too much of a coincidence. So, he assumed it had to be one of the boys' companions. And with that in mind, he prepared to do something he didn't like at all, make a call, and on the other end of the line, a guy with an extremely condescending tone answered, who knew all about the guild's bad situation and mocked it, provoking John's fury. And he threatened him, but the man belittled him, assuring him there was no way he could offer something interesting enough to get his help, until John mentioned the only thing capable of catching his attention. An interesting fight against a very unusual guy, and the person on the other end, intrigued, accepted. And so, the hooded figure, who is clearly Yu's, waited in a dungeon next to a member of Bait, a boy whose name he didn't even care to learn, who was very nervous, doubting that someone as powerful as they said would really appear, and Yu's board warned him that if nothing happened soon, he would start to get impatient, and then, for better or worse, the lunatic they were waiting for finally appeared, activating something inside Yu's, a sixth sense that until that day had been nothing more than a vague hunch. But in front of that being, that intuition was screaming loudly that if he didn't want to die, he had to escape, filling him with an intense emotion that ran through him from head to toe. Although the moment was completely shattered when Kong recognized him instantly, and Yuz also recognized that shadow upon seeing him again, attributing the encounter to Kang's strange hobby of cutting people down, and the protagonist, although he remembered that Kim considered them friends, couldn't help but be suspicious when he noticed Yuz was absurdly rich, and thought he must have some connection to the Bait Guild, so he threateningly asked him directly. Yuz feels deeply offended by the situation, stating that it hurts to be compared to that kind of trash. And Kong, confused, then asks him what he's doing there, and, apparently Yuz knows John's third-rate thug well, and enjoys seeing him humiliated, forced to ask him for help, and with that, Kong considers the encounter over, and goes on his way, even offering him food when he gets out of the dungeon, not realizing that Yuz's mace is already coming straight for his head, barely managing to block the blow, in disbelief. And Yuz, completely calm, tells him that he can't mix business with pleasure, marking the beginning of a brutal clash between the two. And Kong warns him that if he insists, he will die, but Yuz simply trembles with excitement. It being exactly what he was looking for, a real fight, and already charging at full speed, he concentrates all his skills into a devastating blow, so powerful that Yuz barely manages to dodge, getting wounded in the process, amazed by the protagonist's strength. Understanding the level of confrontation that is coming. For Kong, this seems like a waste of time, although deep down, he feels the latent thrill of a fight. And Yuz notices it in his crazed expression. However, the member of the Bait Guild, trying to win some approval from his bosses, made a grave mistake, interrupting them, unable to react when a weapon wiped his head off the map. The interruption kills Yuz's mood, making it clear that he is not on Bait's side, but not on Kang's either. Still, he decides not to earn his hatred, at least for now, although the protagonist already detests him with all his might. And just before leaving, Yuz warns him that Jian, besides being a scumbag, whom he deeply hates, is also the bastard son of a ridiculously rich businessman, and that he should be careful with him. However, Kong didn't care how untouchable his enemy might be, so he simply walks away. But Yu stops him, asking him to hear him out, hoping he would let him in on the game, just to personally mess with John, and apparently they succeed, since John trashes his office upon learning that his dungeons are still being raided and that Yuz has disappeared. And in a fit of rage, he takes out his anger on the guild's vice leader, calling him useless, just like everyone else, ordering them to gather the entire guild the next day. At 8 o'clock, the vice leader doubts that many will show up, but John doesn't want to hear excuses, having zero interest in his men's health or their families, demanding that everyone be there, even if they have to kidnap their relatives. To make it happen, the vice leader tries to reason with him, warning that this would destroy the guild's already fragmented unity, but he doesn't know how to react to such an unhinged leader who is on the verge of losing his mind. And just then the phone rings. It's an unknown number, which an intrigued John answers. On the other end of the line, the voice he hears seems to offer him the perfect solution to all his problems. Meanwhile, social media is blowing up with comments about the guild Bite, which has apparently abandoned its dungeons, and Kong watches it all with satisfaction, seeing how his work is starting to pay off. And Yuz, for his part, understands that if things keep going like this, his fun won't last long. Intrigued, he leans in towards Kong to ask him how he plans to continue, and he slowly leans into his ear and assures him of something that even he finds very creative, starting it all with a note. Mocking note addressed to John, summoning him to a dungeon. The leader, enraged by the challenge, swore to finish this once and for all with that guy and showed up at the location, accompanied by a huge army. However, upon entering, he found no trace of any enemies, and the tension grew among his men, especially among the more impatient ones. And John, frustrated, cursed himself for having to bring all of those useless fools just because he couldn't convince that mysterious guy, the same one from the previous call, whom he had considered more useful than Yuz, believing that with his help everything would be resolved, but by treating him like a mere subordinate, he ended up annoying him, causing the man to withdraw his offer and leave him hanging, earning John's hatred. Meanwhile, in a secluded place, that mysterious individual calmly listened to the latest information on how John was losing his mind, and his subordinate reminded him that the Fate were allies and asked if he wasn't planning to intervene. The man known as Minjun made it clear that they had no intention of helping that piece of trash. The nervous subordinate tried to warn him that the chairman would not like to hear that, but his comment was a mistake, because a series of energy blasts erupted from Min's body, transforming into luminous tentacles that wrapped around his neck, lifting him into the air, annoyed by the insinuation that he had to obey the whims of his elder, staring at him coldly until his subordinate suddenly apologized and finally let him go and left, ordering him to get more money. Meanwhile, John was still waiting for his enemy, but there was no trace of him, and after a long time, he began to suspect that it was a trap, so he ordered his troops to prepare, and just then, the sub-leader alerted him. Something was approaching at full speed. It was none other than an enraged Kong leading a stampede of wolves. John, bewildered, couldn't believe what he was seeing. For a moment, he thought it was a twin, but he quickly accepted something even worse. That Kong had actually returned from the dead. Seeing him approach, he greeted him cheerfully, happy to see him again, and telling him he had brought a gift. Especially for him, an adorable wolf pup. The tender gesture moved everyone present, until Kong, with a disturbing smile, used the creature as if it were a baseball, throwing it with all his might. The act unleashed horror among all the guild members, with everyone screaming in outrage at seeing such an atrocity. One of them, moved by compassion, ran to catch the small creature before it hit the ground, holding it gently, willing to protect him with everyone else confronting the protagonist. And John saw the smile on Kang's face, and in that instant, he understood the true plan, seeing the protagonist carrying a huge bag filled with pups, which only increased the hatred in those roars from their deafening parents, who turned into colossal and out-of-control wolves, advancing with enormous fury as Kong threw all the pups into the air, one after another, letting them fall among the guild's troops like an adorable rain. Suddenly, it turned into a massacre. The adult beasts went berserk and tore the place apart, destroying everything in their path, mercilessly devouring anyone who tried to flee. And John managed to eliminate one of the creatures, but the pressure was overwhelming. Between the invisible wolves and Kong himself, his army would be annihilated in a matter of seconds, and, in desperation, John ordered an immediate retreat. Those in the rearguard, rather than obeying, seemed to celebrate the idea, seriously debating whether to leave the guild once they got out. Although in reality, they wouldn't have much time to discuss it, because from the portal, Yusi appeared, ready to have some fun, beginning to crush heads with a single blow. Watching him, John understood that he had been betrayed. Even so, he looked for a way out while watching his men fall to the wolves and Kong take care of the rest. And in desperation, he resorted to his last option, clenching his fist and unleashing an enormous power that began to flow from his body. Meanwhile, Kong continued to fight his way through the members of the White Guild, who seemed to multiply endlessly, like a plague of cockroaches, and, in the midst of the chaos, he didn't notice John lunging at him, engulfed in flames like a cannonball, ready to wipe out everything. The mobster, accepting his fate, decided to take everyone down with him and unleashed a colossal explosion that consumed even his own men. The power was so brutal that John himself ended up with severe burns, but he still smiled, convinced that it would be enough to finish off his enemy. However, from within the flames, Kong emerged, unharmed, holding him by the head while complaining in annoyance about how warm that ridiculous outburst had been, and then, without giving him time to react, he landed a kick that sent him to the ground. Zhang fell, gasping for air. Zhang fell gasping and unable to stand, but Kong didn't want to kill him yet. After everything he had done, he wouldn't feel satisfied until he eliminated every single one of his followers, and so he did, keeping his word, while enjoying himself. And John, defeated, looked at the disaster around him and understood that everything had ended because of a single meddler. His laughter started as a murmur, but it intensified until it became unhinged cackling, mixed with desperation and madness. And sometime later, the battlefield was covered with bodies, both of the Vates and the monsters they had released. And among the ruins, Kong approached John, who had already completely lost his mind. Yuz was confused, and Kong, in contrast, looked at him with pity. So, he decided not to wake him from his delusion, and, even unaware of his end, he refused to die like that, remembering his entire life and how he had been always treated like an isolated bastard, despised by his brothers, or, at best, manipulated by them, until his father, moved with pity, supported him endlessly. But that only made him a bigger target for his relatives, until one day the world changed with the appearance of the system and the awakened. Zhang believed he had found his chance. However, his thoughts were cut short when in a swift flash his head rolled across the ground, courtesy of Kong, who didn't want to listen to sad villain backstories. And Yuz complained about being left with an unfinished story, but Kong paid him no mind. Still, he thanked him for his help. Even though it wasn't his problem, Yuz asked him how he felt after seeing his revenge through to the very end, convinced that, as the saying goes, the only thing left after something like that is emptiness, and Kong didn't know how to describe it precisely, but he admitted that he was filled within a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness, though one that strangely felt liberating. And he decided to distract himself by checking the items obtained during the battle, considering selling them and splitting the profits, but Yuz replied that he had so much money he didn't need a single coin more, which suited Kong just fine, as he acknowledged that he had never been obsessed with money, because he had always had enough to live on. However, at that moment, he understood that it wasn't enough. Neither his current power nor his resources were sufficient to protect what truly mattered to him from the big shots who dominated the world. Therefore, he concluded that he had to build something bigger. And once outside the dungeon, Yuz officially considers the matter closed. And Kong observes the remains of the battlefield, throwing out a supposed hypothetical question to Yuz, who, without hearing it completely, answered with a simple yes, and Kong asks him to at least let him finish. And then he admits he plans to form a guild, one in which Yuz, of course, had already included himself without permission. The protagonist, annoyed, made it clear that he had no intention of recruiting him, although Yuz knows he tried to recruit him no matter how much Kong kept denying it. So he just made him invite him to dinner, without knowing what. That day marked the beginning of something neither of the two imagined, the birth of a guild, created as if it were a joke between two lunatics that, over time, would become the most powerful and infamous in all of Korea. Meanwhile, in the heart of a monumental building, the chairman of the Hansok group, Jio-san, confronts Min for not having taken care of his son, demanding answers, but Min remains calm, filled with boredom as he listens to how Sen blames him for having no idea where his son is. And the rest of the guild, but Min, with complete calm, makes it clear that he has nothing to do with the fact that the leader of such an important guild ended up being useless. And this only ends up fueling the chairman's rage. Tired of his attitude, he orders his men to eliminate him, with everyone attacking from all angles. But Min doesn't even flinch, releasing his energy tentacles, trapping each one of them, advancing slowly, the bodies suspended around, until he reaches the front of Sam, whom he calmly reminds that he has fulfilled every point of the contract, and that he will not tolerate another act of disrespect. The president, paralyzed by fear, has no choice but to nod, and Min smiles and releases the guards, leaving unhurriedly, reminding him to be punctual with the payment. But before leaving, he confesses that he plans to look for the guy who defeated Jian, just out of curiosity. Meanwhile, in the world, the disappearance of such a large guild does not go unnoticed. And in a short time, rumors spread everywhere. Some media outlets talk about legends or conspiracies. Social media fills up with theories about disappearances in dungeons, and many begin to suspect that it is a new form of organized crime. And in the face of the chaos, the leaders of the Awakened Alliance raise their voices, demanding better rights and protection for the Awakened. And with time and the emergence of new guilds, Bite was simply forgotten. And meanwhile, Kong analyzes the results of everything that happened and concludes that everything had gone very well. He had finished off all his pursuers. Understanding that he had to keep a low profile, he had also obtained a large amount of money with the collected items and had leveled up, plus his psychopathic friend offered him a banquet in his honor. Because of all this, Yuz didn't understand how Kong still looked so down, and he supposed it was because of the new title he had obtained, which made Kong himself tremble just thinking that he was now recognized as the cruel Sunder of Homes, awarded for having destroyed with an unnecessary cruelty thousands of monsters who, according to the system, also had families, being a passive activation title, which just increases the hatred of Kong, who knows full well that with his violent ogre face, this new achievement only feeds the criminal reputation he already has. And Yuz, for his part, takes it with humor, assuring him that the nickname is simply the exact reflection of his personality, and suddenly a call interrupts the conversation. Kong looks at the name on the screen and gets confused, thinking it's the late John, but when he answers he hears Kim's voice, who scolds him for calling her such an ugly name and reminds him of a promise that, of course, he had already forgotten, so she reminds him that he has to meet her boss. And so he ends up at the Dangun Guild, though Kong isn't too sure about bringing that thing with him. Referring to Yuz, even though Kim had given him permission to come along, Yuz complains about being treated like an object and adds that he knows John very well, claiming that he ran into her at a social event, as Kong sees a memory of Yuz at a fancy party, but the image he sees is impossible to believe. On top of that, the protagonist also complains about fate, thinking it's unfair that John is not only so strong, but also ridiculously rich. And so, they finally came before the leader, who greeted them with a smile. Happy to see them, greeting Kong first, whom she had heard so much about thanks to Kim, and she also greeted Yuz, then invited them to sit down, and Kong thanked her for her help and promised to return the favor, but she brushed it off, saying it was no big deal. Still, he insisted on not being in her debt, which led her to ask what exactly had brought them there. And they both agreed they should get straight to the point, though she regretted having to waste the tea. But she gets right to it, asking him if he wants to join the Dangun Guild, only to be rejected instantly. And after an awkward silence, John finally accepts his answer, even though Yu scolds Kong for being so cold and blunt. And Kong doesn't understand the complaints. John, on the other hand, is grateful that he was so direct. Still, Kong planned to return the favor when the time came, but John asks him not to be hasty, thinking he might be useful later on. Though Kong doesn't quite understand how he could help the strongest guild in the country, she tells him there's one thing she's sure of: the peace everyone is enjoying these days wasn't going to last much longer, and in a world plagued with dungeons, beasts, and criminals, the calm is always temporary. Kong, who has already seen a future more terrifying than the tutorial, knows that this peace, although fragile, is better than what's coming. But he can't do much about it, only strengthen himself during the 5 years that he thinks he has before the arrival of the hacker dimension. But John, with a certain discomfort, clarifies that the time has been cut short, and in reality, there are only 3 years left. And according to him, a divinity intervened directly, leaking information through mediums, and Kong assumes he's referring to the administrator, while she laments that despite so much power, no one seems to notice that the dungeons are becoming increasingly difficult, and the users are more stagnant, seeing Kang's case, who doesn't usually watch the news, although luckily I do, explaining to him that apparently skill users grow stronger the greater the danger, which is why they can't use shortcuts like firearms, although long-range ones like bows and crossbows are indeed effective. And John believes that in the coming world, Kong could become a key player, maybe even something like a hero. But he himself knows that doesn't suit him. He has no noble ideas, nor does he pretend to be a good person. To John, however, that doesn't matter. in the slightest, since in the current landscape, he isn't looking for saints or redeemers. He just needs someone brutally strong, and later, Kim returns. After confirming that the two crazies had left, asking Yoon what she thinks of the guy. She admits he surpassed her expectations, noting that for a moment he seemed interested in the conversation at the mention of the administrator, and that's enough for her to deduce that Kong indeed is a graduate of the tutorial. And meanwhile, a large military operation surrounds the entrance of a D-grade dungeon, having a minimal difference of one letter compared to E-grade, but in reality, the difference is abysmal, not only in the strength and number of monsters, but also in the variety of creatures that dwell inside, and in this particular dungeon. That problem is taken to the extreme, facing a huge variety of monsters. And he doesn't know who the final boss will be, since unlike the original dungeons, whose boss used to be a single, more powerful version of the common monsters in the area, he now has to understand the abilities of each creature, which has become a problem. Finding himself in front of a hybrid. Worse, an ogre with a tiny head for its body size. Still, for the protagonist, any target will do right now, since he made a bet with Yuz on who would recruit more members for the guild. However, he is clearly rejected when the hybrid tries to crush him with a hammer. And Kong easily dodges the attack, complaining that those are no manners to respond with. And the hybrid tries to get him by spitting a poisonous liquid that Kong finds disgusting, dispelling it with an explosion. Still, the monster remains standing, and Kong, noticing its acidic drool and that its skin is too thick for his current state, thinks it's very complicated, but Kong is a man who gets things done, so he decides to borrow his rival's enormous hammer, and so, apparently, a cruel torture began that echoed throughout the dungeon, being heard by a group of bandits, whose leader chose to ignore it, as he had found something more fun. The strange girl in armor, who is helpless and surrounded by several of them, with clearly perverted intentions, and even though one of them keeps hearing the monster's howls, warning that they should be worried because something is approaching, but the leader tells him to shut up and orders him to focus on his meal. Not noticing that right behind them, Kong appears, carrying a huge hammer, enjoying the pain he loves so much, that of the criminals he gets to beat up. And no one quite understands what they're seeing when they see Kong lift the hammer with so much difficulty that he first hits the ceiling and then smashes it against the ground, making the entire dungeon rumble, with everyone thinking he was just a madman showing off his strength, wielding a weapon that was too big. And although Kong does admit that the weapon is too big for such an enclosed space, so he decides to save it for another occasion, and the bandit leader, feeling confident, rushes at him, taking advantage of the fact that he's unarmed, but doesn't get very far. Because with a simple flick of his hand, Kong sends him flying, leaving the others paralyzed as they watch their boss land several meters away, and just like that, Kong takes the leader hostage and expects the rest to surrender. But one of them shouts for everyone to attack together, and Kong sighs, disappointed by the lack of loyalty among them. And he asks the hostage his name, and the poor guy barely manages to murmur that his name is Gua, and Kong smiles, delighted to meet his temporary weapon, and lifts him up to use his head to smash into his companion. Although in his excitement it seems he squeezed so hard the hilt of his human sword that he ends up crushing other parts of poor Gua's body. And while the rest of the bandits watch the scene in horror, Kong laughingly asks them to come closer to keep testing his new weapon, showing off Gua's impressive siege power, which apparently has good battle damage, being seen as a monster who calmly advances towards them, enjoying every step, and after many blows, the protagonist finally finishes them all off, acknowledging that they were of a good rank, since it took him longer than expected. And then the girl he saved gets his attention. She thanks him for his help, and Kong calmly replies that he also did it because he wanted to fight, hoping she wouldn't overdo it with the thanks. And the girl introduces herself as Chin Song and wished to know her savior's name. The protagonist tells her, a bit uncomfortably, stating that he's no one famous, but she recognizes him instantly and enthusiastically begs him to teach her how to be as strong as him. And then a voice speaking from the future reveals to us that on that very day the three biggest problems in Korea had finally crossed paths, and Kong looks for a way to truly motivate the girl, but he can't find anything to tell her beyond the obvious, and suggests that she strive and work hard, although she already knows that. And then he clarifies that he's not talking about just any kind of effort, but one that pushes you to the limit, to the point of dying if necessary. Although he analyzes that it's a bit of a hypocritical piece of advice, knowing that he has the resurrection hack on his side, he still recommends that in her case, she just be careful, letting her decide what to do with the beaten bandits, and he walks away without looking back and asks her again if she'll be okay. She admits she can't handle them all, but Kong doesn't have time to help her. So, she proposes to accompany him. He thinks that maybe she's taking the until death part too literally, doubting he can protect her later on. But the girl, insisting, clarifies to him that she knows her limits and can take care of herself, promising not to be a burden. And Kong, not wanting to argue, ends up accepting, and so they continue moving forward together, while Kong takes care of eliminating the monsters. And she collects the treasures, at least being useful to the protagonist, proving to be quite good in combat, using her ability of stealth to move through the shadows, attack by surprise, and cover the angles he can't see, considering her an efficient support, and she also saves him the job of collecting magic stones, and later on Kong warns her that they are near the boss room and suggests she stay behind, but she has no intention of backing down, deciding to go with him until the end. But it's not like she can prove it, because immediately the system warns him that there is no core, and Kong gets annoyed because someone beat them to it. However, he quickly notices that something isn't right. His body tenses up, filled with a bad feeling, as he feels the boss's energy is still there, understanding that they are in the middle of a dungeon break, the first D-class dungeon break. Outside, the media announces that in different parts of Korea, multiple dungeons have begun to open again, following the same pattern from a while ago. And meanwhile, a desperate man looks for the leader of the Awakened Alliance, Choi Don, who was already prepared after receiving the news about the break. However, his assistant informed him that among the active dungeons, there was a D-class one, and Choi considered it a priority, especially upon learning that it was the laboratory, an area that even they had proposed to investigate, so he ordered his best men to be gathered to head to that dungeon and send the rest to cover the others, and for his part, at Dangun, John asked Kim for a report, who informed him that Choi and his team were heading towards the Class D dungeon, although she knew they would arrive late. Luckily, the blonde man reassured her, informing her that the reports indicated that someone was eliminating the monsters quickly. The witnesses spoke of a man with a large sword, a muscular body, and an ogre-like face that was difficult to identify as human, and John smiled, knowing perfectly well who it was. Meanwhile, Kong, covered in blood and completely exhausted, had left a sea of fallen monsters before him, leaving the other awakened ones in the area astonished by such power. One of them tried to thank him, but Kong immediately interrupted him, ordering him to leave just like the others, aware that the rift was still open, and if they stayed there they would die, and although exhausted, he knew he was waiting for the boss monster. And Kong orders them to retreat, but one of the guys insists on staying, expressing that they can also help, and Kong, irritated, asks him how many chimeras he has taken down by himself. The answer is clearly none. So he warns them that if they stay, they will only be a hindrance, and orders them to evacuate the nearby civilians. The others look at him uncomfortably, thinking he's arrogant no matter how strong he is. However, Kong makes the most obscenely weird expression he can think of, managing to make everyone agree to leave. Everyone, except for Chin, who after such a demotivating speech, doesn't know whether to stay or leave. Luckily, she doesn't have to choose since Kong asks for her help from a distance, telling her to find an elevated position from where she can shoot. She nods and gets ready, and Kong waits in front of the dungeon's opening, motionless and patient. The air vibrates with a strange pressure before three colossal figures begin to emerge. These are enormous, grotesque chimeras with the heads of orcs, tigers, and snakes, which he calls the four heavenly kings -1, and he thinks they are as strong as the enemies he has already faced, with the difference that now he will have to as well, to meet the boss, and then a cold, unnatural presence appears from behind it, watching as that figure slowly rises into the air. It's a skeleton sorcerer, who seems to be admiring the city's architecture. And Kong is surprised, as it's the first time he's ever seen a monster speak. The skeleton immediately looks down on him, mocking his decision to face it alone. But Kang's response is simple, pulling the colossal hammer from his inventory that he had taken earlier, being very clear about what he wants to do. Crush it and feed the pieces to the dog. The skeleton boss admires his arrogance, but his biceps even more, and declares that it wants to possess his body. And Kong, with a smile, proposes they settle it like men, a one-on-one fight without the little ones getting in the way, with his proposal being immediately rejected. So Kong reverts to his initial plan, and with a small leap backward to improve his grip, he lifts the hammer and charges at full speed. The beasts try to catch him, but just before he's reached Kong lets out a lion's roar, confusing the chimeras for an instant, taking advantage of that second to jump and fulfill his objective, to furiously shatter the first of the monsters. And just like that, only two are left, and the skeleton observes the scene, being truly impressed by not perceiving even the slightest trace of magic in that blow, it being pure brute force, steeling itself to eliminate him. And the first chimera falls heavily to the ground, and Kong also falls to his knees, suffering from the excessive weight of the hammer, barely managing to look up when the skeleton boss points at him, releasing a mind control beam. The impact hits him head-on, an energy coursing through his body that leaves him paralyzed. And for a moment his gaze becomes empty, as if his will was escaping his body, leaving the skeleton convinced it has dominated him, observing with pride its new human slave, giving its first order to bow before its new master. Kang's body begins to move slowly, as if obeying, until one of his hands rises and the tip, with a very clear and not at all respectful gesture, making it clear that he is not under its control and that it was all thanks to his ring. The skeleton boss realizes that he won't be able to take him alive, so it opts to crush him by snapping its fingers. And the tiger chimera lunges towards Kan, and the creature runs at an impossible speed. Its shadow covers the entire area before pouncing directly on him, and Ken barely manages to raise his arm, covering himself with a part of his Antria armor, and the blow lands squarely, sending him flying through the air until he crashes against a building. The impact shakes the entire area, raising a cloud of dust, and suddenly from the sky an arrow soared through the air and pierced the tiger's head, yet the creature didn't even seem to feel it, which led the skeleton to not consider it a threat, without noticing that Kong had already gotten to his feet. And taking advantage of that brief respite, he thanked Chain for giving him an excellent point of attack, aiming his next strike with precision, sending arrows directly deep into the monster's brain. And only one chimera remained, which attacked immediately, piercing his body, and even through the pain, the protagonist held onto the weapon piercing him, matching strength with the beast. And he finally defeated it by lifting it and brutally slamming it against the ground. And there he freed his sword and finished it off with unbridled fury. And after having fun skinning the serpent, Kong smiled, seeing that all that was left was to finish off the bag of bones. The Lich looks at him as if seeing an exhausted braggart, barely managing to stay on his feet, and Kong regrets that he's right, his regeneration is barely holding on. And even though he wants to, his body no longer responds. He can't jump or throw with enough strength to reach his target in the air, and just at that moment his body goes into shock. Blood spurts from his mouth without warning, and he falls hard to the ground, paralyzed and confused. The satisfied skeleton watches as the effect of the stinger serpent begins to take hold, slowly draining his life, yet Kan manages to get up. Barely breathing, he stands firm, resisting while death nips at his heels, and with the same confident smile, he announces that he's not finished yet, gathering his magic, pushing it to the limit to free himself from the poison, with no choice but to use his last resort, activating his sword's ability, the Berserker's Last Stand, a technique that multiplies his stats for 5 minutes in exchange for his sanity and a handful of deadly buffs. And the air vibrates as his fury is unleashed. His intention is simple: to take the enemy down with him, but he doesn't get that far because he's stopped in his tracks by the surprise arrival of Choi. Advancing with a firm step, Choi thanks the protagonist for holding out for so long as he passes by his side. The protagonist recognizes him as a tutorial graduate and, barely on his feet, covered in wounds, understands that his fight is now over. With no strength left to go on, his body collapses, filled with frustration because in the end his kill was stolen in a very stylish way. And time passes, and Kong wakes up in a hospital next to his sister, whom he considers an unpleasant sight to be the first thing he sees. Upon opening his eyes, she, annoyed by his terrible manners, comments that she would have preferred him to die rather than pay the hospital bills, and Kong, intrigued, asks how the battle ended. His sister, nonchalantly, tells him everything was taken care of, though she admits she was worried when she was notified that he had been taken to the hospital, where he was even greeted by the leader of the Awakened Alliance. And at that moment Kong remembers the card he received a while ago, though he refuses to owe any more favors. And just then, John asks him to stop dying, even if he can resurrect, but Kong clarifies that he doesn't enjoy dying either, since he loses levels and it feels worse than the flu. However, seeing the look on his sister's face, he understands he needs to be more careful. Meanwhile, at the Awakened Alliance, Choi does a little more research on Kong. And his assistant, confused, doesn't understand why he went to the trouble of not only saving him, but also paying all his medical expenses. But Choi was honored to have helped someone so brave, remembering the protagonist's stand in a heroically distorted version. However, he now has something more urgent to attend to. Apparently, the Lich managed to escape, and in the meantime, at the hospital, Kong seems recovered and ready to leave. Just as expected, but his sister is fed up with his smug attitude and reminds him that he was just lucky the Alliance leader paid the bill, and he knows it. Because of this, he has to get back to work quickly, though something catches his attention before he leaves. There was a commotion at the reception desk, caused by a man desperately asking for Kong Hyun, who is told he has already been discharged. The guy regrets arriving late. Or maybe not, because right behind him was Kong himself, who doesn't understand why the man is looking for him, but upon seeing him, the man sighs in relief, showing him his card where he introduces himself as Shinta, from the Ministry of Administration and Security's Awakened Department. The message is clear to Kong. The government has just taken notice of him. So, he takes full advantage of the situation and gets the official to invite him to an absurdly expensive steakhouse, where for the first time he feels like his taxes are good for something. And, in the smoke from the grill, Shinta explains that the government wants to recruit him. It doesn't make much sense to Kong, but he listens. The man explains that his department is new, a kind of emergency plan in response to the rapid increase of the Awakened, stating that it's no longer possible to control them by force, and that having them as enemies would be a grave mistake, which is why the government seeks to support them, establishing a mutually beneficial relationship. Kong gets it, while harshly criticizing the man's grilling skills. Still, putting the meat aside, he asks about the job's perks, and Shinta states that the main one is the financial support that the government will provide, in addition to complete security for his family. And he will also enjoy privileges equivalent to those of a war veteran. Kong notices the benefits are too good, so he assumes it must be a difficult job. But Shinta denies it, as they will be at the service and under the orders of the state, just like Choi and Jong currently are, without it interfering with their other jobs. And seeing only advantages, Kong decides to accept. And after returning to the place where he had left his car, before the dungeon chaos, hoping he wouldn't have to go out and find another car. However, the first person he finds is Chine, who is carrying a bag full of all the treasures she had collected for him, apologizing for not having given them to him before she almost died, and wondering if he had really waited there for days, just in case he came back, but she confirms it very naturally, leaving the protagonist confused, even though he thinks she could have just taken everything without any trouble. Because of this, Chin proves to be too loyal to break a promise, and Kong decides not to press the issue and leaves. But before he can, Chin stops him, begging him to please accept her as his disciple, leaving the protagonist speechless. Meanwhile, in a dark forest lies a huge F-rank dungeon gate. Hidden there is Lich De Jones, lamenting that he had to escape from mere humans. And just then, a figure appears in the forest, who turns out to be Min, who is delighted to find the famous fugitive Lich. The furious skeleton asks him what he wants, but Min tells him to calm down and reminds him that it was he who helped him escape, unleashing his sinister power and proposing that he join him. And in a small dojo, Chin arrives to introduce herself to Yuz, who is surprised that someone like Kong has a friend, and even more so that he convinced someone to join his guild. And at this thought, Kong tries to remind him that he doesn't actually have any friends, but that still doesn't take away the satisfaction of winning the bet, and, according to the rules, Yuz will have to pay for the meal, although in the end,
Yuz always pay anyway.
Still, she accepts her defeat, but she doesn't plan to let the girl into the guild without a test, deciding to take them to a dungeon immediately. Chin energetically accepts, while Kong, on the other hand, knows it's just an excuse for her to go smash some monsters. And now inside the D-rank dungeon, a huge harpy rises up before the trio, who have just cleared almost the entire place, with Chin finishing off the last creature with an arrow that perfectly pierces the enemy's head, and Yuz celebrates her new recruit's performance and comments, who fits in well with the team, and the MC was happy that she passed the test. Although Yuz didn't even remember that, and as Shin gets ready to collect the monster crystals, even though Kong tells her it's not necessary, and Yuz corrects him, since it's still money and she shouldn't just leave it lying around, especially when you're poor. Kong replies that his finances are under control. Besides, the psychopath doesn't collect them either. But he has to remind him that he's rich, with Kong remembering exactly why he hates him. But there's no time for more comments, as Kong senses a nearby presence and Yu's also suddenly perceives it, without being able to identify where it's coming from. Shin, confused, just watches them on edge, until Kong closes his eyes and throws a punch into the air. The punch connects with something that shouldn't be there, revealing a hooded man who materializes and is knocked out on the spot. Yuz watches the scene, impressed by the stranger's stealth ability. Although he notices that he doesn't seem to have any intention of attacking, at least not anymore. And Kong doesn't see it the same way, something his instinct tells him that guy didn't have good intentions. Yuz thinks he's exaggerating, but Kong holds onto his suspicion, stuck in his head, remembering when he signed the contract with the government, with the agent who recruited him, warning him that he soon plans to attack a terrorist group that is causing rifts deliberately. And a while later, the hooded man wakes up soaked with what we hope is water, and he barely opens his eyes, and the first thing he sees are the three lunatics who are watching him closely, tied up, confused, and about to vomit from the smell surrounding him. And Kong confirms that to save water, they woke him up with the liquid that was dripping from the cheek of one of the harpies. The stranger remains motionless, trying to process how the hell he ended up there, finding it in extremely poor taste to do something like that to him. But Kong didn't really care, he just wants a clear answer. To know if he's the fiend behind the dungeons. This question provokes a deranged smile on the man's face, who scoffs at being called a murderer, convinced that his work has a glorious purpose. But Kong isn't interested in his cause, only the information. Even so, the prisoner insists that neither threats nor torture will work to make him betray his sacred mission, and as evening falls, after much pain, the man ends up begging to confess, but Kong doesn't see enough desperation, so he keeps going, evaluating the results after a few, improvised dental extractions. And hours later, a government agent arrives at the scene, surprised that they actually captured the assassin, given the pitiful state of the detainee who is begging to be arrested as soon as possible. And the agent, confused, asks what the hell happened. And Kong gives a not at all convincing excuse about monsters, though clearly the agent doesn't believe him, but takes him away anyway. Yuziang, on the other hand, cheerfully greets the agent, whom he seems to have known since he tried to recruit him, although the sadist never had any interest in working for the government. And Kong observes how complicated his friend is, and the agent prefers to leave the discussion about payment for tomorrow, probably to avoid awkward questions. And the next day, the agent tells him everything he discovered during the interrogation, although Kong already knew everything. The good news is that the government plans to carry out an attack on the assassin group's base in 2 weeks. And Kong thinks they could do it immediately, but the agent explains the reason. As China recently became the first country to complete a rank C dungeon. However, they achieved it by deploying 1,000 men, of whom less than half returned, making it clear how difficult dungeons are, even D-class ones, something that Kong understands very well, since he works alone. The agent adds that Korea will not follow the example of its Asian neighbor, which compensated for its lack of power with numbers, and instead plans to form an elite group to complete the rank C dungeon on Korean territory. And Kong is astonished, especially because he doesn't see the need to try, since China already holds the record, and as long as they keep eliminating normal cores, no, they shouldn't have any problems. And his comment leaves the agent impressed, who didn't expect to hear logic from him. And Kong realizes they consider him a fool, but the agent reveals a disturbing truth. So far, the government has not succeeded destroy even a single normal core, which is why that dungeon capable of wiping out thousands of awakened beings is about to be unleashed in the center of Seoul in just 2 weeks. And noticing the urgency of the matter, Kong assumes they want to include him in that operation. And the agent confirms it, clarifying that according to the rules they don't accept solo participants in dungeons of that level, so he asks him, even if it's against his will, to form a guild. They will handle the express paperwork for the protagonist, pretending it will be a great sacrifice, although in reality, he had already planned it for a while, and right now it turns out to be easier. And so, in a quiet cafe, Kong gathers the few members of his new team to decide on the guild's name, leaving them confused, since there are only 3 of them. And Kong seems to have everything figured out after his meeting with the government agent, explaining this is all a formality for an official mission. And Yuz accepts without thinking too much about it, convinced it will be fun, while Chin interprets it as if they were already some kind of paramilitary group, and the protagonist makes it clear that it's not like that at all, and he certainly isn't going to talk to Chin as if he were his sensei. And with the weird tone of the meeting out of the way, it's time to establish the guild's rules. The first is simple: avoid unnecessary fights. This being a clear hint for Yuz because that's his specialty. The second rule is to return everything you receive, be it a favor or a grudge. That sounds fair to Yuz, and this way Kong ensures they aren't mercenaries. But they won't just stand by idly either, and the third rule is the most direct: become the strongest of all. And Yuz isn't entirely convinced by the first one, but he accepts the others without complaining, and Chin, on the other hand, celebrates it way too energetically. So they move on to the next problem: the name. The first suggestion comes from Yuz, who suggests something that's basically the Three Stooges. The second one, the Lunatics, sounds a little better, but it makes it too obvious that no one there is right in the head. And Chin proposes something that seems like it's from a 60s cartoon: Kong and his strong friends. In the end, Kong decides to handle it himself. Of the name, and I doubt anything decent will come of it, but when they see it they're amazed at how good it sounds. Meanwhile, in a bar, Min receives a report about the man Kong captured, who, apparently, wasn't good at combat, but his invisibility skill made him valuable. His capture delays the plan to collapse the C-class dungeon, and Min wants to know who is responsible. Upon hearing Kang's name, he remembers how that guy has become famous after the events at the academy and the last dungeon collapse, ruining all his plans. And changing the subject, he asks his assistant about the narcotics in the testing phase. The results weren't good. The subjects aren't reacting well. But he doesn't care. He just wants progress, and if there isn't any, his assistant will become part of that experiment. And meanwhile, on social media, the current trend is the formation of a small elite group that will take on the dungeon. Everyone is commenting on the list of selected guilds. In first place is Tengen, considered by many the only decent thing Korea has. Then there's the Skill Users Alliance, both with many followers, mainly because of how handsome their leaders are. And the rest of the guilds are Black Dragon, the Immortal, the Protector, which has much less support, ending the list with the Black Order, who are at least recognized for being good-looking. Seeing that with that lineup, it must be a do-or-die mission, literally, but the focus of the comments is on the Rookies Guild, which, besides having a strange name, they also don't think it's on the same level as the others. Still, at the first official meeting, he leads his team and proudly introduces himself as the Vados Guild, and they intentionally arrive a little late as part of his antics, although according to the voice from the future, apparently it became a habit for him. And in a world that began half a year ago with a dream shared across all of humanity, where guilds rise and fall, one of them arrives making a statement of intent. Although it was a bit difficult for Shinta to accept its name, not at all convinced by the literal translation bad but Kong. He handles internet slang well according to that logic. The name means they're damn cool guys, and Shinta doesn't understand that world. So he figures they'll have to let it slide because they're in a hurry. Still, he asks him to at least arrive early for the guild meeting to plan the raid. But Kong, true to his bad boy role, doesn't promise to do so. And so the day of the meeting arrives, UCI and Chin wait at the entrance with the psychopath, treating the girl as if she were his younger sister. She kind as always allows it. But both of them are still restless because Kong doesn't show up until he finally arrives, apologizing because some beans didn't sit well with him. And UCI doesn't buy the excuse, especially seeing him in such revolutionary clothes. Revolutionarily idiotic, and Khan explains that he's wearing the face of a popular children's character, convinced that this will improve their reputation as delinquents on social media. And Yuzeong can't understand how he actually used all his brain cells on that idea, although the protagonist is completely sure of his plan, despite the final result being a face so elongated that it looks like the character is suffering in an indescribable way, to the point that Yuz is sure that children will cry when they see it. In fact, Kong confesses that he already made one cry, and meanwhile at the meeting, the leaders are complaining about two guilds being late. Among them are Han Ming, master of the Immortal Guild, and Li Chong, a captain of the Black Order. And although the leader of the Guardians Guild, Park Suk, isn't surprised that the Fire Dragon Guild is late, he now sees there's a second rebel in the club, with the most important guilds also a bit annoyed. So Shinta has to fix it by stepping out to make a call. But when he calls Kong, no one answers. So he resorts to calling Yuz. At first, he treats him like a telemarketer about to hang up on him, until Shinta clarifies who he is. Relieved, he reminds him that the meeting has started. And the good news is, technically they're already there. The bad news is that Yuz comments that they're watching something very interesting and suggests he come down to join them. And just like that, right in the middle of an elevator, Kong is threatening the leader of the Fire Dragon Guild, Park Jung-ho, who is completely confused, just like all his men, seeing that someone dares to threaten the leader of the second most powerful guild in the country. All of this started a little earlier when Kong and his group were heading to the elevator. But before the door closes, a hand stops it. It's Park Ho, who asks to get on with all the kindness in the world. Kong agrees, so the entire group gets in with their shiny armor, and the leader notices that Kong is also going to the same floor and greets him kindly, since they will be allies. The protagonist is a bit uncomfortable. He returns the gesture, feeling that there shouldn't be another genius irresponsible enough to arrive so late. Considering his stomach ache excuse is valid, and just then the problems increase. When the elevator can't even go up due to the excessive weight, so they have to reduce the load, and Kong instantly identifies the cause: the exaggerated armor of Park Jun's group, who politely apologizes. Although for Kong it's clear it's not his fault, and then Park Jun decides to ruin the mood when he suggests that they should be the ones to get off the elevator, which is enough to irritate Yusi and Shin, but much more so Kong, who tries to process if he really heard that correctly. And Park Jo, with all possible arrogance, makes it clear that his guild, being the largest and most important, must go up to the strategy meeting first. Feeling that they are the priority, Kong then understands that he is basically being told that his insignificant and irrelevant new guild must wait. Park Jo confirms it, believing he couldn't have said it better. Shin is confused. Yuz lists the order of the limbs he will break, and Kong, with the most monstrous expression possible, believes he will have to fight. Luckily, Shinta appears, managing to stop the whole trivial fight, with Kong apologizing for his medical condition that forces him to punch idiots, and Park is still outraged. But Shinta doesn't want to waste any more time, although Kong interrupts him, stating that for the sake of camaraderie,
He should at least get to know the new guy.
the agent agrees, hoping that Kong will introduce himself, although he asks Yuz for etiquette advice, and he prefers that he do it his own way. So Kong introduces his guild and his only two companions. This leaves Park bewildered, who doesn't understand what kind of joke it is to show up with only 3 people. Kong notices that this only irritates him more, especially because it was the government itself that asked him for help. And the tension almost starts another fight, but Han intervenes just in time. Impressed by the boy's guts, Choi also decides that there has been enough drama and prefers to move straight to the meeting, leaving Park completely speechless while everyone pays attention. And when the atmosphere finally seems to calm down, Yuz draws Kang's attention to someone a few rows away. It was the leader of the Guardians Guild, Sejuan. Kong doesn't understand what's so special about him, or why he should care, but his expression changes instantly when he sees Yuz materialize his mace, while claiming he's going to kill that guy right then and there. The protagonist manages to stop him in time, completely forgetting that he had allied himself with a maniac, and everyone goes on alert, especially Sejuan's guard, who asks his serene master for permission to engage in combat. However, he remains calm until he suddenly grinds his teeth violently, raising his face with a lost and demented look, with the veins popping on his face, before getting up and letting out a lunatic scream, and Sejuan's strange attitude confuses everyone, as he slams his hands on the desk, causing his guard to approach
To see if he's okay.
However, the demented eyes of Sejuan mark him as a target, and, using only his fingers, he slits his guard's throat. And Kong is confused, but Yuz claims he already knew, shaking off the grip to enjoy the bloodshed. However, Sejuan turns out to be too strong, sending him flying with a single blow, throwing him directly at Kong, who worries about him, although he seems to be fine, just surprised by the strength of that other madman. And the protagonist regrets that this guy decided to go crazy right there, in the worst possible place, where everyone is already itching for a fight and looking for the slightest reason to throw the first punch. And sometime later, the meeting room is left a complete mess, but everyone is still standing after having defeated him at the Madden Sea, regretting that they had to eliminate him, as he had become too strong to simply be immobilized, and now all they can do is wonder why he lost his sanity so suddenly, and also how Yuz knew before anyone else, with Kong even thinking that he possesses some kind of special ability to detect danger, as if all his sadistic madness finally had an explanation, but one look at his face is enough to debunk that theory, seeing him as just a simple maniac again, and after the chaos they end up going their separate ways, and Kong complains about being made to wake up early at 11 in the morning, But before they leave, Shinta stops him, since as promised, they will have government support for the guild, having prepared an office for them, and so, in a huge building on one of the highest floors of the tower, Kong and Chin are amazed by the splendor of their new office, equipped with high-end computers, an espresso machine and a huge refrigerator, all for the three of them, although they think they need to hire more staff. But for the moment, the protagonist will take advantage of all that space, planning to move in there, as well as filling the fridge with beer. Yushin reminds him that it's supposed to be a work area, but she won't stop him either. Chin, however, reminds him that they must go to the meeting, initiating a call where Shinto apologizes for the previous incident, which, no matter what doubts they have, is still under investigation, and Kong is amazed at how important Siyu was, who according to Shinta, led one of the most important and respected guilds with the noble task of protecting civilians, with him being a brave and respected leader, which is why he doesn't understand how he ended up like this. This surprises Kong, who is completely unaware of this, which is why Yushin makes fun of him for apparently living under a rock, and Shinta suggests they mute the microphone if they're going to fight, so he does, but only to continue the argument. As the meeting begins, so they are informed that in 5 days, they will raid the C-class dungeon, Benandi Forest, which seems to be overrun by goblins, orcs, and ogres, monsters that to Han are just basic creatures. Besides, he doesn't understand the dungeon's name, though they assume it must be because of the final boss. And John, however, thinks that even though they're simple monsters, they can't let their guard down because, while most of the creatures they've encountered so far seem like simple militiamen, what they'll face in there will be a full-fledged army. That's why Shinta asks the guilds to team up instead of acting separately. However, judging by their expressions of mockery, annoyance, and dissatisfaction, no one wants to do it, leaving Shinta very stressed out, getting even more worked up when he notices Kong is drinking a beer he didn't even realize he was holding, and Yuz, astonished, asks when he bought it. It all turns out to be Chin's doing, who quickly and stealthily brought enough beer to fill the refrigerator, and also brought some dried squid for Kong as she settled in to eat. Admitting she wasn't paying attention to the explanation, Shinta, completely pale, collapses in defeat, seeing that this raid is going to be a complete disaster, and so the meeting ends. The next day, the trio gets a surprise with the arrival of a cheerful Han Moon, who seems very excited to work with them, but Kong doesn't know who he is. Luckily, Yuz reminds him that Shinta sent someone to handle the guild's administration, and that Chin had received his resume. Kong looks it over, his age, height, and body weight, things he doesn't need to know, let alone read on a resume. And yet it seems he graduated from a good university. Meanwhile, Moon is very excited to be working with the famous Kong, whom he recognizes by his demeanor and gaze as one of his own kind, not some petty criminal, but an awakened otaku, and Kong figures that if Shinta sent him, he must be very good, so he welcomes him to the team. This excites Moon, who promises to work his hardest, and later, Moon begins to idealize the absent-minded Kong, the quirky Chin, and the sadistic Yuz, as if they were some kind of imposing team, and Chin, excited by the idea of a growing guild, suggests that they'll need uniforms. Moon gets even more excited when he hears this, especially because she assures it will help with the group's unity, and Kong tries to stop the idea, but it's too late. Chin already had the uniforms made. In fact, she already had them ready, being a huge jacket with a logo so over-the-top metal that Kong only sees it as something a biker gang would wear, with Yuz being the one who designed it, which Kong clearly has no intention of accepting. This is a hard blow for Chin, who, trembling, starts to cry quite theatrically after feeling like all her effort was thrown in the trash. Her effort, which consisted of haggling over the price of the logo and then being scammed by a seller who passed off a bootleg jacket as if it were made of legendary material from a shop with 100 years of history, when the guild shop has not even been open for 2 months. And even though she noticed, she fell for it anyway, seeing the shop as a highly trustworthy place to invest all her money, and when she received the final product, she hugged it like a baby, convinced that Kong was going to love it. And now, after receiving such a cold response, she throws the jacket on the ground and runs to the bathroom to continue crying, leaving Kong with an awkward sense of guilt. And so, on his first day, Moon is trapped in this tense atmosphere while Yuz won't stop criticizing the disheartened Kong for so cruelly scorning the hard work of his little sister, managing to strike a nerve, and in the end, when he has to leave for a meeting, Chin is at the front of the group like a happy little girl showing off her new uniform, and Kong, with no desire to argue further, waits for the car that Chin already got for them, but as soon as he sees it, he freezes. The vehicle has a wild style and Kong tries to figure out who ruined it this time, but this time it was Yuz who admits to creating this so-called masterpiece, and Kong refuses to appear in public with something that looks like it belongs to a gang of kidnappers and demands they destroy it immediately. Still, he's once again in the minority within the guild, with no chance to resist, and Moon in silence tries to process what he's seeing, beginning to doubt if it was a good idea to take this job, and so he ends up riding in the Vada's mobile with the protagonist, insisting they must destroy it or he'll kill Yuz, which only gets him excited at the thought of a fight, and Kong runs out of threats and gets stuck in traffic without understanding why. And Moon assumes there's a fight up ahead, so he gets out to check, only for a person to suddenly be thrown directly at him, bouncing off the van's door, leaving it shattered. Yuz runs over super worried, and Kong is amazed, thinking it's because of him, but it's actually for the door of his work, his artistic masterpiece. However, the one who suffers the most is the poor guy who is thrown through the air, who, upon getting up, sees the most terrifying monster of his life, Yuz, in his awakened demon version, ready to avenge the hit on his car. Meanwhile, the guilds that are fighting are the Immortal Sea Guild, led by the brute force of its vice leader Joe, and the Effort and Discipline Guild, headed by its vice leader Wo, and although his subordinates are worried about the comrade who went flying, a calm Wo knows that guy is the toughest of the group and assumes he'll survive without any problems. However, from between the traffic smoke, Kong appears with his guild, carrying the poor guy like a sack, all beaten up, throwing him to the ground again to step on him and ask them if they are the Discipline Guild, even though he doesn't need an explanation, since the guy under his shoes spilled everything, enough to deduce that it's a gang fight that's delaying the only thing that could improve his mood that day, eating meat. And the vice leader of the Immortal Sea Guild recognizes Kong and his companions instantly, knowing the rumors well about how insane and dangerous they are, rumors that only got worse upon seeing the threatening outfits they're wearing. For his part, Kong demands 500 million won for the damages to his car, and adding the psychological damages for him and his companion, another 500 million, making the total 1 billion. Cheerfully, the figure makes the vice leader Wo, who launches an attack, while Kong doesn't waste time, meeting him with a single fist and starting the fight, and so, after finishing off the entire guild, they decide to leave. However, before leaving, Hulk thanks him for saving him from that confrontation. And Kong wasn't expecting thanks. Besides, he complains that it was his fault. They can't eat meat, while Hulk offers to treat him to one of the most expensive cuts on the market, which, as far as Kong is concerned, means they have just sealed a blood alliance with them. And meanwhile, in an office, a woman waits for her soldiers to return after eliminating the Immortal Sea Guild. We see the leader of the Effort and Discipline Guild, Hanche, who has no idea what they've just gotten themselves into. Meanwhile, at the steakhouse, Joe properly introduces himself to Kong, who isn't paying attention because he's enjoying his juicy steak. And Joe offers to cook for him, but Kong gets serious and clarifies that he only hates 3 things in this world: goblins, Yuz, and those who ruin good cuts of meat, expecting Joe to do it better than him, but he prefers to withdraw the offer. And so, after a lot of meat and beer, the protagonist is satisfied and asks what their real intention is, because nobody would pay such a high bill just to say thanks. And Joe, nervously, asks for their help, explaining that Effort and Discipline and the Immortal Sea Guild used to divide the area in a balanced way, with similar strengths and a non-aggression pact that kept the peace. But all of that was broken when they started invading their dungeons, seeking to provoke them, pushing them into an open war, and just that night their patience ran out. And that's why the fight happened. Yozfiel, true to his nature, wants to join the war immediately, but Kong stops him without a second thought. Moon analyzes the situation and understands that with such a tense atmosphere, a war would be a huge problem, and Kong also doesn't see how a plate of meat would justify such a request for help. And Joe interrupts to tell him that at the rate they're going, his guild is doomed, because Effort and Discipline has become inexplicably strong, thanks to a supposed drug, and that detail catches Kang's attention. Although he knows he can't do anything other than finish the pending raid, what he doesn't notice is that outside, a stranger takes a picture of them, and the image ends up being leaked on the internet. And it immediately generates interest, not only for being a new, flashy guild, but also because of those gang-style jackets with a horrendous design. And because of the very intimidating truck they drive, still strangely enough, several people are starting to find them charming and appreciate their style. The train arrives and Yuz, who sees they were recorded during their meeting, however, it turns out to be excellent promotion. And Shin is equally excited. Meanwhile, Shinta tries to get everyone's attention for his motivational speech with all the guilds listening. He starts over, telling them he won't say something Cheesy like, sacrifice your lives for your country, but something more suitable for them. To come back alive to collect their paychecks. That motivates every one of the guilds, who march towards the dungeon, and the dungeon itself begins to close. With everyone inside, Gohei can only wish them luck and, once inside, Choi calls for everyone's attention to explain that although they will move separately, they will face monsters far more intelligent than any they had seen in the past. For this reason, they will be given flares of 3 different colors. The red one will represent danger, the green one indicates the core has been found, and the purple one signals that the boss has been located. Whatever the signal, the nearby guilds will be obligated to respond to the emergency, and although Park complains that they had already discussed this, and so everyone goes their own way. However, Kong is stopped by Choi, who proposes they work together, stating that even though he knows his abilities, dungeons are unpredictable. Kong sees him as an excellent person, and even though he still hasn't forgiven him for stealing his kill last time, he remembers that he owes him a favor. So he accepts, and they continue on their way together. And during the walk, Yuz complains that the reason they formed a guild was precisely so they wouldn't have to team up with more people, and Kong clarifies that it was an S-class dungeon. They must be cautious, and although Chin agrees, Yuz sees it as an act of cowardice. And Kong is about to react, but stops himself at the last moment, aware that Yuz is just trying to provoke him and that he won't fall for his game anymore. And while they laugh, in the background the members of the Alliance watch them as if they were a group of kids playing, annoyed that with a couple of compliments, they're acting as if they're invincible. And Yuz overhears the comment and lets his psychopathic side starts to show, but Kong stops him instantly, and even though Yuz pretends he won't do anything foolish, although somehow his weapon ended up in his hand, claiming it was just instinct. Even so, the psychopath is surprised that Kong is keeping a cool head, and Kong for his part feels the same way, because he'd also like to punch them, but he forces himself to remain calm. And shortly after, the first fight kicks off, where the protagonist group notices they can at least have some fun while taking care of the goblin infantry, and on the other hand, the Alliance starts to run into serious trouble facing organized monsters, forcing Choi to divide the team into squads and send them to different positions, quickly, orderly, and quite safely. And on the badass's side, Yuz's excited laughter keeps getting louder as he smashes goblin heads, with a completely disgusting expression that Kong has to endure, mentally updating his list of things he hates. First, I don't know, second, people who don't know how to cook meat, and third, exploding goblin heads, and so, he ends up joining Yuz in his madness, enjoying finishing off the monsters so sadistically, while Chino watches them casually, a stark contrast to the guys who had mocked them earlier, who are now terrified for having provoked such lunatics, believing they won't make it out of there alive. And so their first night with Choi arrives, smiling cheerfully upon confirming that the rumors about Kong and his group were true, while he apologizes for the members of his guild who ran their mouths, who are still apologizing profusely, over and over again. And then, Choi proposes to maintain their alliance for one more day. He objects and refuses mainly because of the bet that was made right before they entered the dungeon, when Park Jun proposed a competition to see who could kill more monsters or who takes down the boss, suggesting the loser will be the other's dog, and Kong sees it as pretty sick, but he has no intention of backing down.
And
Park Jun acknowledges that it takes guts for Kong to believe that he and his companions, they will do something decent in there, so he decides to up the ante with something more tempting. An Easter egg that holds a mysterious skill, created by a top-tier prankster, and for Kong in that field no one surpasses the admin. And Park, well aware of how important the item is, leaves Kong confused. Upon seeing that he also knew the admin, trying to feign disinterest. And Park has too much information to keep hiding it, and in the end Kong just asks what kind of humiliation he wants him to perform if he happens to lose, and Park clarifies that he is not interested in making him look like a fool. The only thing he wants is for him to join his guild for 1 year, basically as his subordinate. The protagonist feels the deal is fair and just hopes that there are no tricks, and Park assures him that he is a completely fair man, and that he always keeps his agreements, although for Kong, the numerical difference does not seem exactly fair, but he accepts anyway. And the next day, the fairies are about to split from the Alliance, and Choi seems worried about Kong, convinced that he has already figured out the place, reminding him that he is also carrying an emergency flare, just in case. Even so, Choi warns him that with such individualistic guilds around, the flare will be of very little use. He wishes him luck anyway before they each take their own path. And meanwhile, in the forest, Park and his guild seem to have barely survived a battle, waiting for the damage report and receiving only bad news. They have 3 injured members who can no longer fight, with Park lamenting, falling into the ambush of the dangerous race that gives the dungeon its name, the Fernandi. The situation looks worse and worse, and his subordinate suggests tracking the monsters to attack their base. But Park, already quite agitated, understands that at the rate they are going, they will just keep falling into ambush after ambush, until no one is left, leaving them with only one option: to raise the entire forest, even if it means losing even more men, and the subleader begs him to launch the flare instead. But Park doubts anyone will arrive, and he also doesn't want to allow his guild's pride to be trampled, insisting on destroying everything, so hoping that the wind plays in their favor, he prepares the mages for the final move. Meanwhile, in another part of the forest, the fairies encounter the Barandi scouts who have arrived preemptively. And they don't attack, which leaves Ken a bit bewildered. And Yosuke assumes they're warning them not to pass, or at least something like that, because he doesn't understand their language, and Ken isn't too interested, and plans to launch an attack. But before the 3 of them get closer, the Balandis hang from the trees and start growling at them from above, and Kong is left confused, while Chin and Yuz think that maybe the ogre face of the protagonist scared them, and they also try to decide what to do, considering following them, although Chin doubts they're heading straight into a trap. But Yuz assures him that if they follow, something very fun will happen, and sometime later Ken remembers that something fun for Yuz always translates into pure trouble. And now he is completely annoyed, with arrows all over his body, dealing with more lizards in the trees, enemies that keep their distance. They attack, and when they manage to prevent them from closing the distance, that's when reinforcements arrive, and in the end Yuz also admits that it's really annoying to deal with them, and they aren't even strong, just exhausting. And the protagonist, seeing that if they continue like this they won't get anywhere, decides to use criminal techniques and plans to kidnap one. And no sooner said than done, because somehow Ken manages to capture one, trying to threaten the rest, although the Bernandis just look on confused, having no idea what he's up to, and right after, the Balandis end up escaping in a hurry when the plan fails completely. And Yuz lets out an "I told you so," while Kong remembers that he also approved of that idea, but he just wanted to see what would happen. And now calmer Kong complains about how heartless the lizards were for finishing off their own captured comrade, with Chin seeing them as creatures without morals, and Yuz reminds him that they were the kidnappers in the first place, and just then, in the distance, a flare red rises into the sky, a sign that someone is in trouble, and Shin hesitates whether they should go, and Kong decides they should since they aren't even accomplishing anything there. Meanwhile, a well-organized horde of goblins has the Guardian Guild completely cornered. There, amidst the chaos, their leader's replacement, Hungsi, pleads for them to hold on a little longer until help arrives, but seeing the real situation, he understands it is just a hollow hope so that the end will not be so bitter, remembering the exact moment everything went wrong when he lost his head in the meeting and then refused to abandon the mission out of sheer pride, and seeing the horrible scene of his fallen comrades, accepting that everything fell apart because of his leader's ambition, and barely resisting the onslaught, he accepts his now irreparable mistake. Just as the ogres arrive, convinced that it is the end for the Guardian Guild, resigned, he does not even try to do anything when the goblins break through the guard and lunge straight for him, accepting his fate before the sharp blade that will end his misery. However, an arrow intercepts the goblin in midair, followed by a shout that fills the air, lowering the monster's morale, courtesy of Kong, who soars through the sky, activating all his strength skills to charge the enormous mace that begins to crush monsters, both small and giant, and Hungsi watches bewildered as arrows rain down on the goblins, and those that survive fall under a violent mass of iron. Courtesy of the Vada's Guild, who saved the day, Hungsi gathers enough courage to stand up upon seeing the monstrous power of Kong, capable of finishing off ogres in a single blow. However, in the grand scheme of things, 3 people should not make any difference. Luckily, they are not the only ones to arrive, Dangun and his troops begin to wipe out the monsters with utmost ease, and so, what seemed like a hellish odyssey is resolved in a matter of seconds, to the bewilderment of Hungsi, who watches as Dangun. Since they entered, he hasn't lost a single guild member, and even worse, Vada's is in perfect condition with only 3 members, while behind him he sees the cruel number of fallen comrades, leaving him completely in a trance, until a voice speaks to him from a distance. It's Kan, who after several attempts manages to wake him up, asking if he's still conscious and reminding him that he's the one in charge of the guild, so he tells him he must go with him to plan a new tactic. And meanwhile, in the middle of the forest, the flames consume the Venandi. But the blazing inferno has gotten out of control. And with the change in the wind, it begins to advance towards the Dragon Guild. And Park tries to keep his men calm, assuring them that he has everything under control, believing they can solve everything so easily, giving a single order: run for your lives. And so, around a campfire, with the leaders and sub-leaders gathered, Han proposes going for the core immediately, although John reminds him that they don't know where it is, at least they don't, because the protagonist feels its energy relatively close. Surprising. Guyon with that ability, and immediately, they plan that if they leave quickly, they will arrive before midnight, and Hungsi remains completely silent. In the face of so much leadership, intervening only to say that they should wait, rest a little after that great battle. But he knows that with how cunning the Fernandi are, they can't afford to let them think. Hungsi insists they should rest, but apparently, Dangun has good healers to recover quickly. However, Hungsi, trembling as he sees the state of his comrades, still without time to bury all the fallen, tells them that they are already at their limit, and the protagonist gets tired of the complaints, and asks him if he wants them to carry him to the finish line, reminding him that they must have a clear mind in the dungeon, where if you are weak you can die, as they clearly experienced before they arrived. But he also stresses what the real objective of the mission is and questions, why did he even enter if he doesn't plan to help? Hungsi tries to complain, but he can't say anything more, and Kong, having the last word, he suggests they eat something before leaving. And so the fight begins with the Kremos making their way to the core, which is surrounded by a huge army. Seeing that there are too many, they decide to launch all the flares they have. Luckily, the other Kremos weren't so lost and arrive quickly, leaving everyone ready for the fight, and from the Fernandi side, a huge warrior emerges who Kong assumes he is the final boss, so he jumps over all the monsters, unleashing his enormous mace to go against him. Not giving him time to react, his head ends up scattered everywhere, with the protagonist truly surprised that it was so easy. The same happens with everyone else, as it seems the dungeon's difficulty depended more on quantity and cunning than on power, plus the loot wasn't that great. A sword too giant to be practical, and a bow. For his part, Choi finishes off the last of the monsters, seeing that everything is finally over. Lamenting the enormous number of lives lost, but affirms that they must live for the survivors. Wishing peace to the fallen, and indicating that they will now collect the loot and distribute it outside with everyone in agreement, and although Chino is very attentive to them because she notices how a great sea of fire rises through the forest, catching everyone's attention and leaving them confused about what is happening until they see a colossal fire tornado chasing the only guild that did nothing, with its leader running in terror, begging for someone to save him, causing everyone a great deal of cringe, except for Kong, who suddenly feels that his illness of punching idiots has returned, and, seeing the unnecessary chaos they caused, some terrified people think of escaping quickly, destroying the core to open the portal. However, Kim stops them, although the guy doesn't understand why, since the final boss has already fallen and the monsters won't leave the portal. But, according to Kim's studies, in a state of maximum pressure, the monsters will also look for an exit and, as is the current case, they will invade the city, and although the guy keeps insisting on saving his own skin with a couple more backing him up, until Dangun takes control of the situation and orders them to protect the core to safeguard the city, and this only ends up annoying the guy who launches an attack against the Dangun leader, Jong, who finds it a completely unnecessary annoyance, but he also doesn't need to intervene because Kong appears, dragging the man and throwing him carelessly, wanting to know if all they have to do is protect the core. And Joe confirms it, since the frightened monsters won't consciously try to attack it. And with that reassurance, Kong decides to handle it himself, and Choi wants to help. But the protagonist makes it clear that he'll just be in the way, because this time he wants to try something, activating the giant's strength. His Wind Maximizer, Andre's Carapace, and the Berserker state, ready to fight, leaving Chin visibly worried about him. But Yu comments to himself that he'll probably survive, and Kong waits for the useless members of the Dragon Guild to get out of the way, so he can unleash himself like a beast. Enraged, destroying everything in his path, leaving everyone paralyzed by the savage way. He unleashes his power, but no matter how impressive his advance looks, There are too many enemies, so the rest must also get moving. The guild leaders start crushing goblins, and Shin keeps up constant pressure with her arrows, precisely finishing off several enemies. Even the largest ones are just one move away from being finished off by Yuz, who is enjoying a literal bloodbath. However, a Banandi is agonizing on the ground, preparing a shot, and although Yuz manages to see it, he doesn't move in time to prevent it from hitting its target, which was Chin, who took a direct shot to the chest. Hearing Yuz's desperate screams, Kong also gets distracted, allowing a goblin to rip off one of his arms. Amazed by the strength of these monsters, he regenerates his limb and admits he's having fun, finishing them off with his enormous sword. However, Chin is still on the ground at the mercy of another monster, so Kong rescues her, leaving his back exposed once again, and gets pierced by a Vanandi, and with that, he considers that everything he did was a good show, but also a disaster, since he keeps failing to use his skills properly, and using his shell on his head only to lose an arm because then he moves his arm and gets pierced again, accepting that protecting his body isn't his strong suit, opting instead to just make things explode, so he unleashes a colossal flash that engulfs everything in its path. The result is a shattered hand, and his entire face burned, but what worries him the most is his companion. She, on the other hand, is worried about the state of Kang's body, although he pays no attention to it, ordering her to escape and speak with the leader of Dangun so they can wait for a signal and evacuate everyone. Shin doesn't want to leave him behind, but Kong, with an overly confident smile, makes it clear that this isn't a heroic sacrifice. She decides to trust him and retreats, while he keeps moving forward, buying time with clashes, explosions, and attacks, ending up badly injured, almost out of energy, trapped in a fiery inferno that slowly swallows the entire forest. And meanwhile, John hears from her men that they must destroy the core, as the fire has surrounded it. But she, even facing such an inferno, standing before it, refuses to leave without Kong. And Chien does the same, announcing that as Kong ordered, she will evacuate the dungeon when he gives the signal, although she will stay behind to help him. And John is confused about what signal when a huge blast of energy passes by her side, destroying the core and opening a gate to the outside. And with this done, John just smiles upon seeing Kang's decision and begins the evacuation. And Chien tries to go back for Kong, but Yuz, worried about her wound, stops her, assuring her that he will be fine. That way, everyone waits outside the dungeon, awaiting his exit, until suddenly a silhouette appears. At first, they get excited, but the state Kong is in when he comes out leaves them completely alarmed. Yuz is the only one who approaches, thinking he couldn't handle the injuries, and is walking by. Sheer inertia alone, which he confirms by placing a finger on his forehead, causing him to finally stop and fall to the ground, with everyone distressed and worried. Except for Yuz, who still considers him the best, and for his part, Han seems to be letting off steam with Park after he almost got everyone killed, feeling like he's a disgrace as a guild leader unlike Kong, who is insane but brave, even though he can barely move. But he used his last bit of strength to stop the beating Park was getting, hoping to collect on his bet, those being his last words before everything goes dark. And sometime later, he wakes up in the hospital, in pain but alive, and that's enough to make his companions feel relieved, especially Chini, who can't hold back, and throws herself on him in tears, while he tries to get her off him, since she's crushing his wounds, and with this, the result of Korea's first C-rank dungeon is finally cleared, but the cost was enormous. The Guardian Guild, which was already suffering losses with the loss of its leader, was now practically dismantled after losing half of its men. And for its part, only Park was left from the Dragon Guild, who appears in public to apologize for endangering the entire advance party, and practically wiping out his own guild inside the dungeon. Public opinion on social media is quite direct. Incompetent, insecure, and a terrible leader, and with that disaster, all those strong guilds leave their spots vacant in the top ranks, while, ironically, a tiny guild of only 3 people climbs to the top, thanks to their heroism, but it also gets them a nasty amount of haters, and Shin, of course, doesn't let a single one slide, fighting in the comments as if it were a personal war, and Yos offers her a beer to calm down, but she's still in full-on battle royale mode. He, on the other hand, is bored because Kong isn't out of the hospital yet, though he's at least relieved to know he's just undergoing tests, because his regeneration is so absurd that Yus jokes that if they cut him in half, maybe 2 Kangs would come out, but Jean prefers not to find out, and would rather start training while they wait for the protagonist, everyone except Moon, who is very stressed with the guild's administration after days without sleep. between applications, advertisements, and paperwork, and just as Kong arrives, happy to see the guild didn't fall apart without him, he checks on Moon and treats him as casually as possible, asking him to clean up his work area a bit. This awakens a murderous intent in Moon that he didn't know he had, being the only one scolded in that chaotic place, with such a maniacal look that Kong takes back what he said, feeling a chill for some reason. So he decides to go to Chin instead, giving her Benedi's boss vow, an item of great power and precision that leaves Chin completely moved by the gift. She thanks him profusely while Yuzeong hopes for a little gift, but Kong has no gifts for those who just ate snacks and drank beer while he was recovering, although he can't continue their playful bickering. Because someone is at the office door, it's Hung-si from the Guardian Guild, standing at the door hoping they'll recognize him, but Kong doesn't have the slightest idea who he is, and Yuzeong assumes he's a scammer, while Chin thinks something worse, that he's from some cult, leaving Hung-si speechless, watching as none of the three remember him, even though he was with them on the raid, and even received a couple of insults from them, coming to the conclusion that he is nothing more than a poor, insignificant being. Although they finally let him in, and Hung-si introduces himself again with all the formality in the world, and Kong, greeting him as if it were the first time, offers him a beer out of courtesy, and Hung-si immediately refuses it, unable to understand how they can have the nerve to drink in the middle of the morning, and in an office that doesn't even look like an office. What he also doesn't understand is what the hell the rest of them are doing, as they seem to be playing around, except for Moon, who is still epically stressed, and Hung-si manages to approach him to thank him for saving his life. Only then does Kong manage to remember him, although in his mind he's much more insignificant, and this manages to hurt Hung-si's pride, but he can't contradict him either, and so Kong finally asks him about his visit, but before he can answer, the doorbell rings again, sending the annoyed errand boy Moon to answer, who can only complain in his mind, until he sees on the screen that whoever is at the door is basically about to die. And after several improvised healings, Kong discovers that the injured person is his old friend Joe, the leader of the Sea Guild, remembering him well for the delicious meat he was treated to, and Hansel, seeing the reaction, feels completely overshadowed by a plate of premium meat, and for his part, Kong doesn't understand why Joe went there instead of a hospital, but Joe is looking for him because he needs an urgent favor, asking him to help save his brother. And when he finishes hearing the story, Kong understands that the older brother and the guild leader were kidnapped by the Effort Guild, and Chin reminds him that's not the exact name, but Kong couldn't care less. To him, they're simply the ones who messed up his car. Joe, continuing his story, recounts in anguish how the bastards from the Effort Guild used that thing to boost their powers, and so they wiped out the Sea Guild, immortal, leaving many injured, dozens dead, and his brother kidnapped, basically finishing the guild for good, with the police turning a blind eye since they can't touch the awakened, and Kong doesn't understand so much violence, thinking that maybe there was some ancestral rivalry between them, but Joe replies that while they don't get along very well, never to that level, until they use that thing that made them more aggressive, and Kong, remembering that he owes him a favor, and because that drug worries him, agrees to help, and so they go down to the basement with Yuz, excited to finally avenge Poppy, his mega death truck, and Kong remembers telling him he should have it dismantled, but Yuz has no intention of obeying. However, what they don't understand is why Hung-si followed him there, and he, nervously, remembers that he never got to say he had arrived, but since he doesn't want to seem desperate, claims that as part of the Guardian Guild, he must help protect humanity. Besides, he's worried about that thing, as it could be related to the way his former leader went mad, and although he's just improvising, both he and Kong admit that he made a good connection. And meanwhile, at the headquarters of Effort and Discipline, their leader receives a report that Joe got help from a guild called Vadas. She interprets it as a perfect opportunity to avenge the beating her men received, with overwhelming aggression, planning to eliminate him, and meanwhile Hung-si doesn't understand how he ended up as the driver of such a weird car. While Kong asks Joe if that enhancer pill is called Monster Power, Joe confirms it, but he doesn't understand why the five of them are going to the fight alone, but Kong assures him that he has his contacts and immediately calls 80, to whom he tells him about the Den of the Pills, which is the Effort Guild. Despite people having already heard rumors, nothing was confirmed, so the protagonist tells him that they are conveniently going to raid them, hoping they will send him some reinforcements, but Shinta is completely annoyed that it's going to be more nonsense, trying to calm him down, and explaining that all his personnel are in dungeons, almost begging him not to make a move until they return, but Kong pretends there's a bad signal, and then turns to Choi, who admits he doesn't enjoy conflict, and can't intervene because of the Alliance's rules, apologizing. Yuz scoffs, saying so much for his influential contacts. And Joe, on the other hand, is worried, unlike Kong, who is confident he can take down an entire guild by himself, although he will probably die at least one time in the process, remembering his days as a masked avenger, deciding to take up those old habits, targeting the dungeons first. And so they arrive at an undead dungeon, one of the least popular places to farm because they drop few items, except for this one, where the monsters literally bleed jewels, being the main source of income for the disciplined guild. And a small group was there, and the leader was scolding the lower rank members for bringing back too few jewels, forcing them to go back and look for more if they wanted to earn their food and pills. And the subordinates, deep in their addiction, murmur about how their superiors are just as addicted, without noticing the figures that begin to appear in the thick forest fog, while the leader, who is trying to have a quiet smoke in his tent, complains that his lighter is out of fluid, looking for someone to give him a light. But he discovers that no one is there, not even the watchman, and then an uncomfortable feeling runs through him. Feeling watched, uneasy, on high alert, but he only sees a small owl, looking at him from its branch, trying to laugh to pretend he's not scared. Even so, the laugh is not at all convincing, and he decides he's just imagining things. Until he hears another noise, however, there's still nothing in that direction. Until he turns around, and there is a completely terrifying being, with a twisted smile just inches from his face, which rips such a heartbreaking scream from him that it echoes throughout the entire dungeon. A minute later, the leader of the Effort Guild arrives with her secretary, bewildered by the scene in front of her, seeing all the men from the dungeon, traumatized, trembling as if they had seen something indescribable, something that to her is complete nonsense, in a low-ranked dungeon, and her pale assistant informs her that they received an urgent message, and in it is announced that Allegra Mayovadas has taken the dungeon and that they are willing to return it in exchange for all the pills and Joe's brother. The leader is left blank and unable to understand what kind of lunatics they are facing. Meanwhile, in the dungeon at the hijacked camp, Kong, Yuz, and Shin are taking things way too calmly, with the protagonist's only complaint being that the beer got warm, while Chin thinks about how to solve that. On the other hand, Hungsi and Joe don't understand how they don't feel a single ounce of tension, and Joe breaks the silence, doubting if what they're doing will actually work, and Kong considers that the very polite way they sent their demands will convince them, confirming it when someone appears at the entrance of their tent, throwing Joe's brother as if he were an old sack. He's quite hurt and traumatized, and Kong tells the duo that arrived that they forgot something: the strengthening medicine. A hooded woman clarifies that it's in his pocket, but there he only finds 3 pills, and an annoyed Kong complains because he had asked for all of them. However, the other member of the Effort Guild, is furious at how disrespectful he is to the vice leader of their guild, and Wow, who is still so traumatized by his last encounter with Kong, to the point that he can't lift his gaze so as not to be recognized. Although Kong, seeing him trembling, recognizes him. Because of this, Wu clenches his fists, trying to regain a bit of courage by shouting for them to begin the attack with an army surrounding the store, as Kong admires the epic entrance with a smile. But the result reported to the guild leader, Chai, is that the entire squadron barely made it back alive, and this sends her into a kind of frenzy. Furious because they didn't respect the agreement they had made, expecting her assistant to explain why. But she is just terrified seeing her state, which worsens when Chai starts smashing her entire office to pieces in a state of uncontrolled rage. And to her assistant's terror, she confirms her fears. Ever since they took that drug, everyone has gone crazy, and now she orders them to buy all the medicine possible with the guild's money, planning to start a war, ignoring her assistant's complaints. And now calmer, Chai tries to understand what Kong wants with this declaration of war, and she thinks and thinks, but every second she only gets more frustrated at not finding something that can explain how her enemy moves, and she fears that if she doesn't discover the reason behind it all, they will be the ones to fall into a trap. Meanwhile, at the hospital in a quiet room, a subject bandaged from head to toe is being treated. This is precisely Wu, who despite his condition, is wide awake, barely managing to remember a few scenes from his last encounter with Kong, letting out a lunatic laugh, as he thinks he has finally figured out what Kong was after, and it was simply to provoke them. And so, Chai, furious, ends up gathering her entire guild, preparing for a war on a level never before seen in South Korea. Meanwhile, Kong is calm in his office, trying to understand what the stress that overcame Park is, aware that it's related to the admin. But he still doesn't know what to do with it, so he puts it away. And then Yuz arrives, worried that after 2 weeks since the attack, the Effort Guild hasn't made a move, but Kong knows why. Since after his attack, he went to talk to Shinta, who still can't believe they really attacked. At least he was waiting for the evidence, and Kong brings him for free the enhancer medicines, with Shinta grateful for the support, until the MC takes them from his hands because he wants to ask a favor first, and so the news announces the discovery or investigation of the new substance that increases strength and aggressiveness, as well as the guilds that were using it, and he uses that as leverage because Shinta had told them they didn't have time for such things, but Kong knows that letting something like this slide would make the government even more useless. So with the pills in his hands, he had no choice but to carry out a proper investigation. Yuz is amazed, but dissatisfied because he was expecting a war, and Kong on the other hand starts to take a liking to using this diplomacy. Even so, Yuz looks restless, suddenly standing up, suggesting the MC follow him, and Kong doesn't understand a thing. But the answer comes on its own when a colossal fireball crosses the sky and explodes right into his office. And after the huge explosion, Kong emerges from the rubble, furious and completely naked, and Yuz turns around casually, reminding him that he had warned him about his bad feeling, and Kong, irritated, complains that he never explains anything clearly, but for now, what worries him the most is all the attention that spectacle drew, with all the people below already recording videos. So the first thing Kong does is cover his junk before he starts trending again. And for his part, Yuz is at least glad that there were no injuries, because Kong doesn't count, since he's too durable, and Mui, apparently, doesn't count either, because they don't even remember him while he's under the rubble, begging for someone to get him out before he gets crushed to death.
And, at least,
he survived, as he's taken away in an ambulance, though he promises to return for revenge, and upstairs Shinta tries to process the MC's incredible physique, who is also annoyed because those were the only clothes that Yuz could get for him quickly, and Shinta prefers to ignore that, and asks who did that, and Kong has no idea since he was just chilling and doing nothing. And Shinta asks him about someone who might hold a grudge against him, which makes Kong think for a good while. And Shinta assumes he's thinking so hard because he couldn't have hurt that many people to provoke something like this, but it's the complete opposite. Kong counts at least 20 suspects, and Yuz tells him to stop messing around and looks at the sky, from where flyers with the word effort are falling. And a furious Kong sees his next target, and meanwhile, Chai runs desperately until she finds Min, who sees her exhausted and asks her exactly why they decided to contact him. For their part, Kong and Yuz plan to go on the attack, although Shinta is worried, but Kong has no intention of letting that invitation slide. So the people decide to help them however they can, which confuses Kong, since he had previously told him he couldn't do it. However, Shinta replies that the ones distributing the monster power are the same murderers from the dungeons. I discovered it after investigating the guy who gave it to him, who was part of a much larger group, so thanks to Kong, a vital piece was found. Although he didn't even remember the guy, but putting that aside, what he does know is who the leader of it all is, Min Choi, who is smiling as he sees the desperate way Chai is looking for him. She, barely able to breathe, doesn't understand why he did something so impulsive, like that explosion, seeing how he destroyed everything her guild wanted to build, remembering how she just wanted to hunt more monsters, advance her guild while helping humanity, and that's why she wished to be stronger. And crying over her own decisions, she unsheathes her enormous axe and looks at the one responsible for everything, marching furiously towards Min, who notices quickly that she is surrounded by a group of subordinates from the Effort Guild, whose consciences finally got the better of them. Then Chai orders the attack, but Min just smiles sadistically at the sight of those insects, unleashing his tentacles to catch them all, sending them one by one to brutally strike Chai. Her soldiers want to help her, but the pressure makes it hard for them to breathe. Their necks give way to such force, and Min advances towards her, dropping each and every one of the lifeless members of the Effort. Only Chai remains, to whom he throws several monster power, demanding she take them now. Confused, she looks at his sinister presence that scorns them. But at least she can serve as an experiment, waiting for her to at least fight before she dies. Meanwhile, Kong and his group arrive at the Effort Guild, but everything is destroyed, and Hungsi assumes they erased all their tracks before escaping. However, Kang's biggest question is why Hungsi is there. although he keeps pretending it's because he's from the Guardians Guild. And to protect humanity, but Kong cuts him off because he's not interested, seeing that they surely won't get anything out of that place until Chin warns him of something strange on the guild leader's door, and Kong hastily opens it, hearing the last wails of a dying woman full of pills. Chai, who begins to remember how, when the tutorial started on Earth, she and her friends became skilled enough awakened to reach level 4, however, at that time she didn't think about becoming truly active in the guilds, being nothing more than a normal, ordinary employee. Unlike her friend Jige, who, being a bomber, saw an opportunity to help many more people. However, her nobility was cut short at the hands of a horde of monsters, and Chai was unable to attend the funeral, crying alone in frustration, angry not with the rescuers, but with herself for not being able to save her friend, feeling that Jige died because of her weakness. So she decided to protect her memory, vowing to become stronger. However, Kong cuts the story short, calling it sad that she's telling such a pitiful story, and Chai understands and apologizes to Kong for having attacked him. In that state of madness the pills put her in, and Kong doesn't even know who she is. So he asks Yuz, who doesn't know either, but assumes at least she wasn't a vagrant. And Hungsi watches how cruel they are being to the leader of the Effort Guild, and for her part, Chai ends up taking it with humor after losing to people like that, but in the end she feels that therein lies their strength, and she wants to tell them something about the one truly responsible for everything, who is. After telling them everything she knows, she warns them that he is someone very strong, and Kong assumes he is on the level of Choi and John. However, Chai claims he is even stronger than the two of them combined, believing he is a tutorial graduate. Upon hearing this, the protagonist fears what a graduate could be. Unreported to the government, thinking it can only bring trouble, even though he himself is one. And for her part, a final surge of energy shakes Chai's heart, understanding that her time is up. So, she wants Kong to be the one to put her out of her misery, hoping that in the future, he will do the same for Min and come to her guild. Kong doesn't promise anything, but draws his weapon just in time because Chai loses control and lunges at him, intercepting her with a single move, dedicating some last words to her, that if she is reincarnated she should become someone strong and good, and Chai, just before dying, smiles, recognizing him as a true madman. After that, they call Shinta, hoping he will handle the rest. Thus, dawn arrives, which Kong and his guild watch from the destroyed office of the Effort Guild. And the protagonist thinks about going back to his own office for some beers, forgetting that it's also destroyed. Still, he looks on the bright side. At least they took all the items from the corpse. Some of them are really good. Except for the Mad Dog one, apparently, it makes his bite stronger. Although Yusi and Jean think it's perfect for Kong. And meanwhile, Hungsi watches them from a distance, labeling them as truly insane, but very powerful. That's why he understands them now. Their guild doesn't need loyalty or justice, only power. However, he already saw the examples of two people who desperately sought power, and considering that the only one capable of leading what's left of his guild is Kong, he finally stands firm to ask Kong for the Vada's guild to accept the Guardians, and apparently they are rejected because Hungsi is now following the protagonist, insisting on all the benefits of having a popular guild and competent members joining them, but he only ends up annoying Kong, who brings out his most threatening side to finally get him to shut up, and so Hungsi ends up leaving like a scolded puppy. And Chin comments that they shouldn't let weird people into the office, although Yuz doesn't even know which office. And Kong thinks that Chenta will take care of him, considering training him, but he doesn't get to say it when a huge horde of crazed zombies runs towards them, chasing Hungsi. Meanwhile, the news starts to report on the incomprehensible cases of humans losing control and attacking others, spreading with absurd speed throughout the country, and it's suspected that the monsters, or the awakened, could be behind the chaos. The soldiers try to contain the situation, but these irrational beings move with such extreme violence that they don't even have time to react, hesitating to attack the civilians. But the crazed ones attack them immediately. Luckily, Kong ends up saving them, annoyed at how slow they are, and makes it clear that, even though they are civilians, if so many come at the same time, there's no way to contain them without attacking, although he just wants to get it all over with. Time for lunch, and the soldiers don't understand his logic very well, but they decide to help anyway as they watch him run, to continue finishing off the threat, and in this way, South Korea was plunged into total chaos for an entire day. By the second day, everything was already under control. However, social media is filled with comments about the lockdown and, above all, videos of Kong massacring people with divided opinions, except on one dio, where they do have a consensus. The protagonist is scary, so Kong tries to improve his public image a bit, hyping himself up in the comments, but Yuz interrupts him. Just in time, with Kong feeling caught, trying to hide his embarrassment, acting as if no one saw him, although no one really had. Luckily, Chin changes the subject when he comments that the house is nice, assuming it will be their new headquarters, and Kong clarifies that it's only temporary. But he still wants to thank Shinta for the place, and Yuz sees it as unnecessary and tedious. But Kong calls him anyway, and Shinta, however, has no time or patience
to talk to him.
Still, Kong takes advantage of the little time he has to thank him for the safe house, but he has another favor in mind. And Shinta insists she's busy with the investigation on the monster power, so she asks him to hurry up. And Kong understands, so the protagonist says it without any context. He wants her to get him some poison, a very specific one. Shinta, really confused, would rather he give her more context, but Kong just insists that he wants a poison that doesn't damage the organs. Shinta assumes he's investigating what happened before, but she can't do much, since that type of poison is expensive and Kong thinks he can afford it. But when he hears the amount, he decides to hold a guild meeting instead, proposing a brainstorming session to get some money. And Chin is the first to suggest they start selling merchandise. And while Moon, who has apparently returned, is Googling how to kill his boss, his first task is to set up a complete merchandise line, making him hate that guild more and more each day. He's planning to escape before he loses his sanity, and meanwhile, everyone else is calm, until someone rings the doorbell, and Chin goes to see who it is, finding Hungsi, with no one understanding how he managed to find them. And Kong asks them not to let him in, because he'll just insist on joining the guild again. And Yuz thinks it would be good to grow, but Kong doesn't want to deal with people who are too nice. Still, Hungsi doesn't stop ringing the doorbell, so Kong sends Yuz to destroy it, without specifying whether he meant the doorbell or Hungsi. And Yuz, delighted, is ready to use his skills, wondering which leg to start with. Luckily, Kong was indeed talking about the doorbell, and Chin then clarifies that it's not just Hungsi anymore, but there are 3 sad, hooded figures in the rain. And once inside, Kong apologizes for the discourtesy and offers them imported barley tea, although everyone knows it's actually beer, and the other visitors turn out to be Joe and Song, the brothers from the Immortal Sea, in addition to Hungsi, and Kong tries to understand how they found a government-safe house, and apparently, Shinta accidentally mentioned it to Hungsi. And Hungsi passed the gossip to Joe, and Song simply followed him. Kong concludes that the government has terrible security, but they're already there, so he decides to hear them out. Hungsi tries to speak first, but they silence him immediately. And Song takes his place, thanking him for saving his life and apologizing for not saying so at the time, when he could barely breathe, and both brothers show respect for saving him and for crushing the effort guild in the process. The protagonist admits he only did it because it was convenient, but he still doesn't understand why they're there, and then Song asks to join the Vadas Guild. And Kong gets irritated because people keep showing up looking for a job when he has no intention of admitting anyone until they pull out a huge bribe of the highest quality beef, which is enough for Kong to accept, and Hungsi sees it was easier than he thought, so he offers to be their cook and pay for dinner. And just like that, the protagonist accepts, sending his jack-of-all-trades Moon to handle the admission paperwork, and Moon overhears how they're just giving away jobs left and right, and asks them to hire more administrative staff. Since Kong doesn't understand any of that, he agrees without issue and leaves it to Moon's discretion, making him a team leader, and everyone applauds, which makes Moon think about continuing his search for mercenaries, and Kong now needs to know the levels of his new allies who, unfortunately for him, turn out to be very weak compared to UCI. And Jin is also lower, but he's still stronger than the guild leaders of the guild, and seeing this, Kong figures that the other members will be even weaker, so he wonders how he should handle this, and asks them to bring all the guild members the next day. They think they can do it now that the recent chaos is over, but they don't see the need to rush the registration, but Kong, however, is no ordinary paper pusher. He wants them for a dungeon. Song thinks it's too soon, thinking they should have a plan first, but the protagonist doesn't need a plan. For him, the best plan is the instinct that awakens when you're crawling in agony inside a dungeon. His confidence is so absolute it sends a chill down the former guild leader's spines. Indeed, the bad feeling they get on that stormy night seals their fate. And so, the next day, right in front of the dungeon, Kong, along with his crew, stands before the new members and recites the only 3 rules of the Vadas Guild: no unnecessary fights, return what you're given, and repay favors and grudges. and be the strongest. And he says this with a demented look on his face. Min begins his welcome, and going back to the previous night, when Kong asked how many new members there would be, Hungsi stated that on his side there would be 10, since many left after their objectives changed, but he assured him that the elite ones stayed, and for their part, the immortal sea only had the brothers left, although they would see if there were any other poor souls to include, and Kong takes it into consideration. And he wonders if they will survive the coming days, and Hungsi worries about that, mumbling, but the protagonist pretends he said nothing, hoping they at least bring a healer. Apparently there's one, and Kong thinks she will do. And returning to the present, the newbies are worried about the strange orientation they are receiving. But Kong reassures them by telling them they will only have to fight in a dungeon, clarifying that they shouldn't worry about their lack of preparation, as they have two incredible, yet distracted and carefree guardians with them, whose expressions convey complete distrust. And so they begin, and it isn't long before one of them is completely overwhelmed, to the confusion of the rest, but Kong, with total disregard, insists that he get up and keep fighting, and Hungsi, seeing his men, asks him to at least let them rest, but Kong believes that in a place like this, they can only become strong this way, sending his healer to help her companion move, but poor Yeja is also at her limit, vomiting blood, and Hungsi begs him to be considerate, but Kong finally notices when he sees she's almost out of mana, explaining to Hungsi what it means to reach that state, since from that point on, her body will enter a state of constant alert, her heartbeat will increase, and her gaze will sharpen. A state so dangerous that he discovered it as insane mode, to the bewilderment of Hungsi, who can only listen as an excited Kong claims it's the best way to raise stats without leveling up, something no one had ever heard of before, much less applied to healers, and Kong knows that's the reason they level up so slowly, so the only way to improve, just as he did, is to always be on the brink of death. But everyone there only has one life, and they don't want to risk it. Just as a huge stone golem arrives to attack a shield bearer. However, the monster is easily shattered by a single blow from Kong, who clarifies that they must try harder, promising that he won't let anyone die there. Meanwhile, a very excited Yuz, along with Chin, brings more golems for training, with some rookies already preferring to die. However, Kong doesn't want them to fear death, just to fight for their lives. And so, a huge commotion erupts on Instagram because of a photo uploaded by the Vadas Guild, in which they recruited members en masse. But the most remarkable thing about the photo is how those rookies seem to have the faces of rabid dogs after days of fighting without eating, with the public agreeing that they all looked scary now, and, meanwhile, finally outside, Jin's group, completely traumatized, complains about Kang's inhumane methods, thinking he doesn't have an ounce of justice in him. Although Hungsi asks him not to talk like that, especially since he no longer holds the position of leader, and Vieja makes a complaint, crying, feeling that at the rate they're going, someone will die, and Hungsi looks at her worriedly, while one of his men begs him to reform the Guardians Guild, sure that he can raise it from the ashes, and Hungsi slams the table, admitting that every part of Kong is the definition of a true lunatic, which excites his companion, but Hungsi stops there because he is the strongest of all. The Awakened, knowing full well that under his command, they won't be able to practice the ideals of a guardian, and he's also clear that by his side they will become stronger, and since he saw the C-rank dungeon to save humanity, a strong heart isn't enough, they basically need raw power. Feeling that the justice of the weak carries no weight, and, in that way, Hungsi doesn't ask them to follow him blindly, but to trust him, even though no one is completely convinced, but it seems they will give him a chance for one more week, and so a week passes in a swampy dungeon. Of E-rank, some guys move through the swamp, annoyed by how sticky the place is. Yeah, however, he at least feels that it's an excellent spot for farming, where they happen to find a huge trail of fallen goblins. Although no one collected the magic stones, seeing it as a bargain, they start to pick them up, sincerely thanking the madman who left them there. However, they quickly notice a nearby battle and fear that the crazy person who left them there might want to come back for them, so they decide to leave quickly. But a huge horde of goblins blocks their path, and they know they can't face them, until, out of nowhere, arrows intercept the goblins, courtesy of the crazed rookies from Vadas who, after just 1 week, have already become demented beasts, thirsty for blood and a greater challenge. And he feels they are getting a bit arrogant over such a small thing, watching as his excellent students mercilessly slaughter all the monsters in front of the Terrified onlookers who watch as that army of mini Hanks continues on its way as if it were a horde of beasts, and that's exactly how the rumors label them. Because of this, Hung-si, now seeing his friends turned into cavemen, enjoying their food after a bloodbath, reminds them of what they talked about a week ago. Feeling that with such a good foundation, they can now separate from Vadas. But the one who was desperate to leave now wants to stay at all costs, shouting, usually backed by his companions. Feeling that they are now true guardians, and Hung-si prefers to walk away, taking out a clearly luxurious credit card so they can eat to their heart's content. While he goes ahead to take care of something, and as he walks down a desolate street, he remembers his old friend C, hoping that wherever he is, he's okay. Telling the sky that, despite what happened since the guild was disbanded, the members are doing well, holding on to their convictions more than ever. However, he can't help but feel that there's something horribly wrong with all of it. End of season, chapter 67. Well, folks, I hope this has brightened your day, made you smile, or simply kept you company. And if so, please leave a like, a nice comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'm posting all the announcements on Instagram, in case you want to follow me, and more videos will pop up here if you want to see more. And thanks for everything. I love you all a ton.